Chapter 856. This chapter was uploaded by a netizen. After the decision was made, the postnatal grand heavenly immortal realm cultivators bid farewell to each other and went to various parts of the Six Absolute Nebula. The Six Absolute Nebula wasn't limited in size, but it existed in an extremely ingenious structure, waiting for adventure. This structure made it so that no matter where the nebula was, no matter which direction one took in a straight line, it would inevitably return to its original position. This made it so that no matter which direction one took, there was no difference in the difficulty of exploration due to the difference in direction. The other postnatal grand heavenly immortal realm cultivators and even martial emperors had once split up to explore various parts of the Six Absolute Nebula in search of the key to destroying the center of the Six Absolute Nebula. However, Luo Fan still did not move. Instead, he floated on the spot and frowned as he looked around, carefully sensing the various changes in the surroundings. He was an exterminator, and the world he saw was completely different from the world that ordinary cultivators saw. The truth hidden behind the appearance was not concealed in his eyes at all. It was precisely because of this that he could see through the surrounding fog that could isolate the six senses without the help of any technique. At this moment, the entire nebula formed a mysterious cycle in an indescribable way in his eyes. No matter which direction he looked from, he could not see the end of the nebula, and he could not see the differences in the various directions. It was as if all directions were the same and ordinary. The laws and principles in the void existed in an extremely mysterious way. This way of existence was completely different from the more than 3,300 eras that Luo Fan had experienced before. It was completely different from the eras of eras. These rules and laws weaved into a giant flat net in the void. This giant flat net enveloped everything, and the boundless gray fog relied on this giant flat net. It was precisely because of the existence of this giant flat net that the various substances in the nebula existed in the form of gray fog. It was also because of this giant flat net that the nebula could possess the ingenious power of isolating the six senses. However, although he could clearly see that this was a huge net formed by laws and principles, the profundities contained within it were unimaginably profound. However, the mysteries contained within were so profound that it was unimaginable. There were several rules and the way in which the laws were connected. The complexity was simply sensational, causing Luo Fan to not know where to start in order to see through it. He was unable to find the center of this huge net. Luo Fan stood there, his brows furrowed quietly. He lifted his foot and took a light step forward. In an instant, he stepped onto a mysterious node of rules and laws. There were countless nodes under this huge net of rules and laws. These nodes were formed by different rules or laws intertwined together. Every single one of these nodes had a special effect, and every single one of them contained some sort of special mystery. The way Luo Fan stepped on this node was naturally not like how an ordinary person would step on a normal person. Ideally, his movements were unimaginably gentle. His body was secretly in tune with an extremely profound posture, distorting in the void into a posture that ordinary people could not do. It was precisely because of this stance that his body did not come into contact with the other laws and laws that were unrelated to this node. It was also because of this stance that he could not cause any changes to the other laws and laws. It was also because of this that he could truly step on the node. If his posture did not change, even if his stomp was correct and his strength was correct, the node would still change due to the influence of other rules and laws. As a result, his stomp would fail, and he would not be able to truly step on the node. The moment Luo Fan completely stepped on the node of the huge net of laws and principles, an indescribably profound feeling brushed past Luo Fan's body. In an instant, Luo Fan's figure disappeared in the boundless fog. Along with this change, Luo Fan's perspective underwent an earth-shattering change. It was as though in an instant, he had once integrated into this huge net of laws and principles. Everything in his eyes had completely changed. The surrounding fog completely disappeared under this change. In his eyes, apart from the boundless void, there were strange creatures living in an extremely strange way. These creatures had extremely strange shapes and did not have a fixed shape at all. It was like a ball of strange matter that changed shape and color. It was very ordinary. At the same time, the world that he heard of also changed. Reborn Elven Ranger, the noise instantly drilled into his ears, causing him to instantly enter the noisy market from the previously incomparably silent and misty world. Ordinary people. These sounds were extremely ingenious. It seemed to be a language that Luo Fan had never heard before. It was extremely complicated, and the changes in tone were thousands of times more complicated than Chinese. Luo Fan had never heard of these words before. However, he was an exterminator, a weak existence who had comprehended the true meaning of extermination. As long as these words contained their thoughts, he could naturally sense them. Therefore, in an instant, he understood the meaning of these noisy words. Food is coming, hurry up. Ha ha! I can finally have a full meal. I didn't expect that there would actually be people in this world who would dare to enter here. They really don't know their place. It's been over 3 million years, I can finally eat food. These chaotic words poured into Luo Fan's ears without reservation, causing Luo Fan to frown deeply. Looks like these creatures are not good people. As his brows furrowed, he sighed inwardly. However, although he was sighing, he did not feel that there was anything wrong with this. Perhaps there were creatures that he did not understand that had to live. Naturally, they needed to seek energy from the outside world to replenish themselves. Even ordinary people were guilty of the most heinous crimes compared to the creatures that they treated as food, let alone these creatures that lived in this nebula that was filled with fog. To them, anything that entered from the outside world could be considered a thing, even if it was an acquired grand heavenly realm cultivator. At this moment, some of the creatures finally discovered that there were creatures that were different from them in their world. They sneaked out, and the entire world suddenly fell silent. Following that, numerous gazes focused on Luo Fan. Luo Fan quietly sensed that there were at least trillions of these gazes. It was obvious that the number of these creatures was at least in the trillions. The frivolous bandits being stared at by so many creatures, a mortal's mind would have long since collapsed, and their consciousness would have perished. However, to Luo Fan, it was nothing at all. His determination had long reached an unimaginable level. Nothing from the outside world could shake his mind, let alone a few gazes. Facing the gazes of countless creatures, Luo Fan smiled quietly and said, "I wonder who can answer some of my questions?" The language used by Luo Fan was not the language he usually used. Instead, it was the language that he used when conversing with these creatures. It was the kind of language that he was completely unfamiliar with just a moment ago. The reason why he could speak like this was because the speed of his thought activity was unimaginably fast. In an instant, he could rely on the boundless consciousness that he had received and combine it with the few peculiar intonations to directly analyze that kind of language, and thus completely grasp it. As Luo Fan spoke, countless noisy curses rang out. "Kill him! Kill him! Hurry up!" At that moment those creatures and their peculiar methods flashed and pounced on Luo Fan. These creatures were creatures whose appearance and color were constantly changing. As they approached Luo Fan, their figures changed as well. This change was extremely ingenious. It seemed to be a change in the essence of life. As their shape changed, their essence seemed to be changing at every moment. But no matter how they changed, they still existed in this strange void, and the way they moved was no different from before. Luo Fan was a destroyer. The world that his eyes saw was vastly different from that of others. At this moment, after stepping on the node of a certain law network and entering this strange void, he saw many truths hidden behind this void even though his perspective had completely changed. The Holy Accord, therefore, he could easily see the mysteries hidden behind the way these creatures move. The way these creatures moved, ideally, was completely according to the rules and laws. In other words, they completely relied on the flat surface above the law network and slid along the rules and laws below the network. And the positions where they stopped happened to be the nodes of the rules and laws, which were similar to the node that Luo Fan was stepping on at this moment. From this point of view, the way these creatures moved was no longer as unpredictable as before. Instead, it was extremely smooth, extremely profound, and the trajectory of their movements was extremely exquisite and indescribable. Such a trajectory was extremely profound. It contained indescribable wonderful effects, as if it was faintly describing some kind of origin principle of this six absolute nebula. Just as Luo Fan was comprehending the way these creatures moved, some of those creatures had pounced on Luo Fan. And the moment they pounced on Luo Fan, their shape completely stopped changing and fixed under a shape that surprised Luo Fan. This shape was none other than the shape of Luo Fan. Whether it was his figure, his clothes, the rough lines of his skin, even his pores, hair, they were all the same. There was no difference at all. It was as if a mirror had suddenly appeared in front of Luo Fan. In fact, one could even tell that their aura was extremely similar to Luo Fan's. However, the strength of Luo Fan's aura was too strong. It was many times stronger than theirs. No matter how heaven-defying they were, no matter how incredible the changes were, they could not completely imitate him. There's actually such a wonderful effect? Seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but be secretly surprised. With a thought, he raised his right hand and pressed it down quietly. A tangible force instantly covered the void within a radius of 100 miles. Beasts roaming the world at this moment, the void within a radius of 100 miles was filled with tens of millions of those ingenious creatures. They densely wrapped Luo Fan into a ball from all over the world. The moment the tangible lilies produced by Luo Fan's right hand appeared, all the creatures within a radius of 100 miles instantly felt an indescribable palpitation covering them. Then, the right hand that was pressing down suddenly clenched. Screams filled the world. All the peculiar creatures within a radius of 100 miles were crushed into powder by the tangible force in an instant. Tens of millions of such ingenious creatures were completely wiped out in an instant. After wiping out these tens of millions of creatures, the numerous peculiar creatures finally understood how weak, cruel, and fearful the creature in front of them was. They no longer dared to clamor and pounce like before. Instead, they kept moving forward while screaming, wanting to get as far away from Luo Fan as possible. Although they have all kinds of ingenious abilities, they are too weak in essence. At most, they are equivalent to the longevity rank. Even the stronger ones are only equivalent to the pure yang rank. I haven't seen any perfected rank ones at all. Luo Fan seemed to be relying on a tangible force to quietly crush them, but in reality, he had complete control over that tangible force and completely grasped any creature crushed by that tangible force. Therefore, after killing these tens of millions of peculiar creatures, he had a general impression of the strength of these peculiar creatures. You go over. Luo Fan looked at the many creatures that had participated in the battle thousands of miles away and formed a vacuum around his body. He raised his hand and pointed at one of the pure yang rank peculiar creatures and said, "You go over." That pure yang rank peculiar creature was considered a relatively weak one among the many peculiar creatures. The tens of millions of such creatures around him were obviously led by him. However, after being pointed at by Luo Fan, it instantly let out a scream and shot back at an unimaginable speed. It did not even have the courage to fight against Luo Fan. It turned around and fled. Since Luo Fan had spoken, how could the Vajra demon subduing divine power of the other world let him escape so easily? With a quiet thought, a peculiar force quickly shook along the nomological network and instantly left the vicinity of the pure yang rank creature. It suddenly wrapped around the peculiar creature and pulled it away from Luo Fan's side. The creature screamed and kept moving forward, wanting to get away from Luo Fan. However, no matter how hard it tried, it could not break free from Luo Fan's strength. It could only continue to incite the peculiar force in its body in vain. And its shape, as it stayed in front of Luo Fan for a longer time, was getting closer and closer to Luo Fan. After a few breaths, it was exactly the same as Luo Fan. Apart from the fact that the creature was panicking and seemed to be in a sorry state, its temperament did not have the charm of great perfection that Luo Fan had, and its eyes did not have the indifference. Its appearance was exactly the same as Luo Fan's. Even its aura was quite similar to Luo Fan's. In fact, Luo Fan could even discover a kind of seemingly right but actually wrong power gradually circulating in his body, constantly tempering his body. Seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but secretly praise it. This creature's special ability was clearly quite ingenious. Its imitation ability was so strong that it could even imitate a destroyer like him by 30% to 40%. This was simply a heaven-defying ability. Moreover, most importantly, this imitation ability was only natural. As long as it got close to the other party, it could imitate it. It did not even need him to voluntarily control it. This made Luo Fan feel mysterious. He felt that it contained many truths that he had never thought of. Because of this praise, Luo Fan did not speak for a moment. His eyes shone with a probing light as he quietly looked at the pure yang rank creature. The creature struggled for a long time. Seeing that it could not break free, it did not dare to look at Luo Fan. It only hurriedly knelt on the ground and begged bitterly, "Great Immortal, please spare me! Great Immortal, please spare me!" What happened just now was just a misunderstanding. Luo Fan shook his head and suppressed the admiration in his heart for this creature's special ability. He did not say whether he would spare the creature's life or not. He only asked, "Are you willing to tell me about your results?" How could that creature dare to say no to this question? The suffering of tens of millions of his kind had yet to fade in his retina. If he said no, what awaited him would definitely be the same fate as those tens of millions of his kind. A mind-reader expert in the city obviously, with the creature's personality of loudly begging for mercy, it could not say no. "Yes, yes, no matter what Great Immortal wants to know, I will tell you everything I know." The creature seemed to have been pulled out of an abyss as it cried out repeatedly. "Who is the strongest person in this 6 absolute nebula? Where is he?" Luo Fan asked directly. "Is this the 6 absolute nebula?" That pure young life form suddenly froze and actually murmured. However, he quickly reacted. This wasn't the time to be wondering about this. He hurriedly said, "The weakest one here is the Lord of Annihilation. He is constantly in charge of the local sacred land." "Lord of Annihilation? How strong is he?" When Luo Fan heard the creature's words, his heart moved and he asked, "This, how would I know? It's just that the previous king was 100 times weaker than me. After he went to meet the Master of Annihilation, he never came back. I heard that he was killed by a single glare. That's why I can become one of the kings of this area," the pure young creature said unwillingly. As for why he was one of the kings now, Luo Fan did not need to think to know that it must be because after the king, who was 100 times weaker than him, separated, the other pure yang creatures that were suppressed by the king could not suppress the other, so they established themselves as kings, splitting the originally weak region into several smaller regions. "I see. Where is the sacred land with the last result?" Luo Fan smiled quietly. He had a vague feeling that the sacred land must have some kind of connection with the center of the 6 absolute nebula. When he reached there, he would definitely be able to find clues related to the center. Chapter 857. Full-text novel updates the fastest. He thought to himself, Luo Fan quietly? Thinking about it, Luo Fan quietly smiled and said, "Since that's the case, how about you take me to that place's holy land?" Although it was an interrogative tone, the pure yang-level living being obviously could not treat it as a real interrogative. It was extremely clear that if it said no, then the fate that awaited it would definitely not be escaping and ascending to the heavens. Therefore, it did not dare to say anything else, and could only agree repeatedly. "Lead the way," Luo Fan said indifferently. The pure yang-level living being hurriedly nodded and turned around. Using its unique walking method, it flashed and disappeared, almost as if it was teleportation, heading towards a certain direction. Luo Fan was already very clear about their method of traveling, and it was completely under his control. At this moment, his movements naturally did not have the slightest bit of hesitation. Using a similar method, he stepped on the nodes of the giant web of laws. What was different was that he was teleporting, following behind the pure yang-level living being, and unhurriedly heading towards the sacred land with the living being. As they moved forward, the many living beings that were far away in the surroundings seemed to be avoiding the plague. They frantically fled to all corners of the world, constantly giving up a certain area around them, not daring to get close to Luo Fan. From afar, Luo Fan and the pure yang-level living being seemed to have an immeasurable repelling force. As they moved forward, all living beings in the surroundings were continuously pushed away by him. These living beings living in the 6 Absolute Nebula were actually not that weak. On the contrary, these living beings were extremely weak. At least, to ordinary living beings, they were simply impossible to resist. Even a postnatal grand heavenly realm cultivator might not be able to resist a pure yang-level living being if they did not have a great perfection magic treasure that could allow them to barely sense the situation around them. If they were a little unlucky, even an immortal realm living being might not be able to resist them. The reason for this was none other than the fact that these living beings could move about freely within the 6 Absolutes Nebula and fully unleash the might of their divine abilities. As for other living beings, even if they were postnatal golden heavenly realm cultivators, their 6 senses would be severed due to the environment of the 6 Absolutes Nebula. Normal living beings only had 5 senses, but cultivators would cultivate the 6th sense due to cultivation. This was normally the perception of a cultivator's divine sense, and to ordinary cultivators, this was the limit. Only creatures that specialized in perception would cultivate the 7th, 8th, or even 9th sense. If such creatures were to cultivate, the 6 Absolute Nebula would naturally be a path for them, and it would not affect them in the slightest. However, for many living beings, once their 6 senses are severed, they are completely cut off from all perception of the outside world. To them, even if there was a weak attack flying towards them, as long as the attack did not reach them, they would not be aware of the existence of the attack. Chapter 858. Following Luo Fan's words, the overwhelming aura that was pressing down on Luo Fan suddenly increased 100-fold. It had almost solidified, turning into a screen that covered the sky and pressed down on Luo Fan. Such pressure and impact would be fatal to an ordinary connate Grand Luo Realm cultivator, but it was nothing to Luo Fan. His expression did not change at all. He was still smiling, as if he was waiting for the creature that was emitting the aura to answer his question. "You're very strong. At least, you're the strongest cultivator I've ever seen in my hundreds of millions of years of life. However, you shouldn't have stepped into the central sacred land," the voice said coldly. With that, the space around Luo Fan instantly changed. The giant net of laws and laws in the central sacred land instantly became chaotic. It was as if the net of laws and laws was changing billions of times at every moment, causing the world in Luo Fan's eyes to change and become shrouded in mist. The countless strange creatures disappeared from Luo Fan's eyes in an instant. In an instant, Luo Fan understood that this was a shocking change that had occurred in the giant web of laws and laws. He could no longer step on the nodes of the laws and laws, so he could not enter the world where countless strange creatures lived, and fell back into the surface world of the 6 Absolute Nebula. At this moment, his position was still the same as before. There was no difference at all. In reality, there were still many mysterious living beings around him. Even the Destruction Master was still observing him from his original position. However, he was unable to step on the nodes of the laws. Hence, he was unable to see or sense them. After Luo Fan lost the nodes of laws and laws, an extremely obscure strange power that merged with the surrounding mist attacked the back of Luo Fan's head from behind. It did not emit any information at all. The speed of this power was unimaginably fast. It had already reached the back of Luo Fan's head almost at the same time. The might of this power was unparalleled. Although its aura was hidden and contained, without leaking out at all, just by looking at the faint distortions in the surrounding space, the change in the space that seemed to have been shattered but was completely fixed by the power, without truly shattering or dissipating, one could tell that the power of this power was far greater than that of a perfected state. Even if Luo Fan was hit in the back of his head without holding back, he would not be unscathed by such power. Although Luo Fan did not see the appearance of such a force, he instantly grasped the traces of its existence. With a thought, he raised his hand and the force shook for an instant, breaking away from the control of its original master. Like a tamed snake, it wriggled and turned in front of him, constantly circling in the void, as if it was acting coquettishly. Luo Fan had a body of strength, and he cultivated the inheritance of the Herculean Tao Master. The power in his body was close to the source of power. Under such circumstances, attacking him with power was simply showing off one's slight skill in front of an expert. If one's method of using power had reached the acme of perfection, it would have some effect on the deepest level of power from the inside to the outside. For example, although the power in front of him was unparalleled, it did not contain too many imprints, and the method of using it could only be called exquisite. For Luo Fan, how could it be a threat? Not a bad power. Luo Fan casually played with the power and smiled faintly. This power was not purely some kind of power. Instead, it was an extremely exquisite power formed by the agglomeration of dozens of different kinds of power. It had many wonderful uses and had many inspirations for Luo Fan. With a slight thought, the few life imprints contained in that power instantly collapsed. That power completely turned into a kind of ownerless power. It became even more agile and lively, as if it had suddenly obtained freedom. How is this possible? At this moment, a cry of surprise entered Luo Fan's ears. Next, a faint, illusory figure condensed in front of Luo Fan. This illusory figure was in the shape of a human. It looked like a skinny middle-aged man. The middle-aged man had a fair face and no facial hair. There seemed to be a frightening divine light in his eyes. There seemed to be endless lightning flickering in his eyes. An indescribable violence and destruction seemed to seep out from his body. When he saw this middle-aged man, Luo Fan instantly made a judgment. He was obviously the Destruction Master. Only such an existence could be called the Destruction Master. At this moment, the Destruction Master that had appeared in front of Luo Fan was merely an illusory figure. At the very most, it could only be considered a shadow. Its real body was clearly still hidden in the strange world that Luo Fan had stepped into earlier. I don't like such an exchange. Luo Fan smiled faintly. With a thought, he lifted his foot and stepped on a law node that was changing hundreds of millions of times every moment. That node was originally changing at every moment. However, the moment he stepped on it, all the changes and activity instantly disappeared. It returned to its normal appearance, one that was as stable and unshakable as a mountain. With this stomp of his foot, he had completely suppressed all the changes in this law and node of the law, causing the law and node of the law to return to their original state. The moment he stepped on the node, the world in his eyes changed at the same time. It returned to its previous empty appearance, and was no longer like the boundless fog from before. When his vision returned to its original appearance, he saw the skinny middle-aged man a short distance away. However, the skinny middle-aged man was not at the position that had appeared in his vision. Instead, He was dozens of feet away from that position. Clearly, the Destruction Master did not intend to directly expose himself to Luo Fan. How did you find the method to enter the central sacred land so quickly? The Destruction Master's expression was extremely shocked at this moment. He opened his mouth and asked, "As long as I can grasp the pattern of changes, I will naturally be able to enter and exit this place at will. What is so difficult about this?" Luo Fan smiled. With a thought, the power in his hand that he had grabbed out of thin air, which was made up of dozens of different powers, shook. In an instant it was like a spirit snake. In an instant, it crossed a distance of dozens of feet and rushed directly in front of the destroyed master. With a sudden turn, it was going to tie up the destroyed master from head to toe. The Destruction Master's reaction was also relatively fast. Although he was shocked by Luo Fan's strange ability, he still suddenly trembled. He raised his hand and slashed down. In an instant, the void collapsed. Countless rules and laws wrapped around the snake-like power like chains. With a sudden lock, the power was instantly locked in place. Although the power was already around the Destruction Master, it could not completely bind him no matter how hard it tried. Luo Fan had already expected this. With a slight smile, he raised his hand and pointed. That wave of power produced some kind of extremely wonderful vibration. The rhythm of this vibration was extremely mysterious. It contained some kind of supreme principle. It was as if it was evolving the mysteries of the universe's composition. In this mysterious vibration, the locking of the rules and laws suddenly broke free. They could no longer have any effect on the power. The power was no longer obstructed. It tightened and directly bound the Destruction Master. This power was extremely mysterious. It possessed unimaginable power. The moment he was bound, the destroyed leader felt dizzy. He could no longer move any of the power in his body. Even his own power disappeared in the process. He became limp and powerless. His entire body instantly became limp. It was as if all his bones had been taken away. He had become a pile of rotten meat. Luo Fan raised his hand and the Destruction Master, bound by the power, gradually floated towards him. It directly floated in the void in front of him. "Now, you can answer my question properly," Luo Fan smiled and asked. Although the Destruction Master was dizzy, he could not use any power. He could not summon any will to resist. He was not completely unconscious. Naturally, he could communicate with others. At this moment, the Destruction Master already knew how great the gap between him and the cultivator in front of him was when he felt the mysterious power seeping into his body. He no longer had the arrogant attitude from before. He said, "You are such an expert. Why do you want to make things difficult for my 6 ultimate sacred tribe?" "I just want to ask some questions." Luo Fan shook his head. The Destruction Master naturally did not believe these words. He was not the pure sun being who had led the way. He would not believe a few words from Luo Fan. At his current level, he was already extremely clear that the actions of an existence that could so easily subdue him were definitely not as simple as they seemed on the surface. Moreover, such a powerful existence would not easily make a move. The 6 Ultimate Nebula was a forbidden area for cultivators. If it was just to ask some questions, how could such a powerful cultivator enter this place? Therefore, this cultivator definitely had a deep plan. Perhaps his questions were true, but they were definitely not just questions. Although he understood all this, the Destruction Master was not someone who would rather die than submit. He would not sacrifice himself for the so-called righteousness of the 6 ultimate sacred tribe. Therefore, when he felt the huge gap between him and Luo Fan, he said helplessly, "What questions do you have?" Although he had submitted, he still could not bring himself to do so. He was still reserved and wanted to preserve his last bit of dignity. Luo Fan did not mind such an attitude. He could not be bothered to suppress the last bit of restraint in the Destruction Master. He asked, "What is so mysterious about the central sacred land?" The Master of Destruction had thought that he would ask about the treasures in the 6 absolute nebula. He had even prepared a few answers, but he did not expect that he would ask such a question. He could not help but be stunned for a moment. Luo Fan frowned slightly. However, he was more patient with the Destruction Master, who had surpassed the Great Perfection Realm, than the pure Sun Realm living being. He did not rush the Destruction Master and waited for the Destruction Master's answer. The Destruction Master's reaction was not slow. After being stunned for a moment, he had already recovered. He frowned and said, "The Central Sacred Land is the sacred land of my race. It is the place with the densest 6 ultimate yuan qi. It is also the place with the highest terrain. It is 1,000 times easier for living beings of my race to cultivate here than in other places. Moreover, if one fuses their thoughts with the sacred land, they can naturally sense the general situation of the entire 6 ultimate nebula." With a thought, Luo Fan was already 70 to 80% sure that the core of the 6 ultimate nebula was in the Central Sacred Land. After all, the various characteristics of the Central Holy Land were usually only possessed by the core of a single location. After making this judgment, Luo Fan continued to ask, "How did you become a master back then? How did you fuse your thoughts with the Central Sacred Land?" This was the crux of the matter. The Destruction Master was currently under the eaves, but he had no choice but to lower his head. After hearing Luo Fan's question, he carefully explained how he had coincidentally found something in the Central Sacred Land and fused it into his body, allowing him to break through the Great Perfection Realm and become a master. After that, through his research, he sensed that there was a certain close connection between him and the Destruction Master, or rather, the thing that he had fused with his body. Then, through that connection, he used that location as a breakthrough point to fuse his thoughts with the Central Sacred Land. After hearing these words, Luo Fan could not be bothered to say anything more to the Destruction Master. His eyes flashed, and he raised his hand to cover the Destruction Master. In an instant, a probing power descended from his hand and directly enveloped the Destruction Master. After which, it continuously seeped into his body through the apertures all over his body. It continuously studied the inside and outside of the Destruction Master's body. It studied the mysteries of his body, and from there, searched for the item that had fused with his body and allowed him to break through the Great Perfection Realm and become a master. After that item had fused with the Destruction Master, it had naturally undergone a huge change. It no longer looked like it originally did, and it was basically impossible to directly find it. However, since that item had fused with his body and allowed him to break through a cultivation level, it was naturally impossible for it to not leave any traces on the Destruction Master's body because of its close connection with the Central Sacred Land. As long as he found those traces, he would be able to restore that item. However, the result would not be affected at all. The probing power was extremely mysterious. It was a power that directly probed the source. As it entered and exited the Destruction Master's body, endless information was naturally transmitted into Luo Fan's mind through this power, allowing Luo Fan to gain an increasingly deeper understanding of the Destruction Master's situation. Soon, he discovered the traces left behind by that item. With a thought, the probing power suddenly changed. It turned into a colorless flame that directly burned the Destruction Master. The Destruction Master had already felt that something was wrong when Luo Fan had begun to send power in and out of his body without saying a word. However, he did not feel much pain. Although he felt humiliated, he could still barely endure it. However, at this moment, the moment the power suddenly turned into a colorless flame, he felt that every part of his body, from his spirit to the ends of his hair, was unbearably hot and in indescribable pain. This kind of heat and this kind of pain was so intense that it was indescribable. Even with his intelligence that surpassed the level of perfection, he was still unable to endure this kind of heat and pain. He opened his mouth, and let out a series of miserable howls that shook the heavens and the earth and shook the entire universe. The screams spread far and wide, and the entire central Holy Land was shrouded by the screams. The countless creatures living in the central Holy Land shivered when they heard the screams. In an instant, their faces were filled with extreme fear. These living beings in the central sacred land were not simple. They had lived here for at least a few decades. They were naturally very familiar with the Destruction Master's voice. At this moment, this voice that had always been superior and in control of everything was emitting such an earth-shattering and extremely contagious howl. How could they not panic? The Destruction Master's howl changed in a parabolic pattern. At first, it became louder and louder, and it became more and more miserable. When it reached a certain limit, it became softer and softer. Finally, after a few dozen breaths, all the howl disappeared without a trace. The Lord of Destruction, who had controlled the entire 6 absolute nebula for hundreds of millions of years, and could even kill a great perfection realm being with a single glare, disappeared along with the screams. In the place where he had been, there was only a crystal stone that seemed to have a whirlpool spinning slowly in it. Luo Fan raised his hand and the fire that had enveloped the crystal stone returned to his body. The power that he had obtained from the Destruction Master dissipated. After that, the crystal stone fell into his hands. I see. This thing reflects the entire 6 absolute nebula. Although it is not the core, it is closely connected to the core. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. As soon as the crystal stone fell into his hands, he instantly understood its mysteries. Although he did not completely understand all its mysteries, he understood its surface function. Understanding this, Luo Fan did not hesitate. He had already wasted several months in the 6 absolute nebula. Although this was not a long time, it was not a short time either. With a thought, he followed the direction of the crystal stone and walked towards a certain place in the central sacred land. After the Destruction Master was turned into ashes, everything in the central sacred land had returned to normal. The laws and the giant web of laws had also stopped changing. Therefore, very soon, Luo Fan followed the direction of the crystal stone and arrived at a certain location in the central sacred land. As expected, this is where the core is. Looking at the location, Luo Fan was overjoyed. Registered members can receive private benefit. The Great Text of the Great Desolation. Chapter 859. On the surface, this spot did not seem any different from the other spots. If one were to look at it from a normal perspective, it would be shrouded in mist just like the other spots. Text first, however, in Luo Fan's eyes, he could see that there was an extremely mysterious distortion in the laws and the giant web of laws. The distortion was extremely subtle and profound, and it was extremely difficult to detect. If Luo Fan had not already become a destroyer, and his eyes could see countless times more things than an innate Grand Luo realm cultivator, he might have missed this subtle difference. The countless strange changes made this spot vaguely point to the entire 6 absolute nebula, making this spot have an extremely close connection with the entire 6 absolute nebula. With a slight thought, Luo Fan sent his perception into the crystal and that spot at the same time. The relationship between the crystal and that spot was extremely mysterious, but there was a huge difference in the rhythm between the two. This difference made the crystal and the spot closely connected, but at the same time, there was an extremely strong repulsion. This kind of repulsion prevented the crystal from fusing with this location due to the close connection between it and this location. Instead, they resonated with each other in an extremely strange way, as if they were breathing in and out. Cutting his perception into the two, Luo Fan carefully sensed the difference in the rhythm between the two, using his own perception as a bridge to slowly communicate with the two, constantly harmonizing the rhythm between the two, so that the rhythm between the two gradually blended together. Luo Fan was already a destroyer, and his divine power was boundless. Such an action might be relatively difficult for other cultivators, but it was extremely simple for him. With just a slight thought, the entire process was completed. The moment this process was completed, endless information flowed into his mind through his senses. In an instant, his mind seemed to have been magnified countless times, and everything in the entire Six Absolute Nebula was instantly included into his senses. At this moment, he seemed to have become the Six Absolute Nebula, and everything that happened within it seemed to be happening to him. The endless Six Absolute Sacred Clan, the 20 innate Grand Luo Realm cultivators, including the martial monarch. All of them were clearly within his senses. Sure enough, this is the way to communicate with the two. Luo Fan instantly let out a long sigh and a faint smile appeared on his face. While listening to the destroyed leader's explanation of how he had become a lord, he already had some guesses. He guessed how he could communicate with that thing and this strange place, and he guessed what would happen after he communicated with it. The current situation was just as he had expected. In fact, it was even more mysterious and profound than what he had expected. He carefully sensed everything in the Six Absolute Nebula. Luo Fan's understanding of the entire Six Absolute Nebula deepened. He was beginning to understand the nature of the Six Absolute Nebula more and more. The Six Absolute Nebula was filled with endless fog. In fact, it was not an ordinary fog. In fact, it was not even a real fog. Instead, it was a materialized product that blocked the six senses of living beings, caused by the marvelous changes of countless laws and laws. It was not because of the fog that the Six Absolute Nebula had the effect of isolating the six senses. Instead, it was because of the special property of isolating the six senses. That was why the fog was formed. With a slight thought, Luo Fan suddenly had a feeling that he could control and change everything in the Six Absolute Nebula at will. This feeling was so clear. It was so real that he could not doubt its authenticity at all. With a slight thought, the martial emperor, who was originally withstanding the attack of the creature at the full perfection realm, instantly disappeared from his original position. When he reappeared, he was already in front of Luo Fan. At that moment, the martial emperor was resisting the hidden attack in the fog. He suddenly realized that the scene in front of him had changed. His body had already appeared in front of Luo Fan. He could not help but be slightly stunned. However, his reaction speed was quite fast. After seeing Luo Fan, he immediately knew what had happened. He could not help but smile bitterly and said, "I never thought that the first person to find the key point would be you, Brother Luo. It was just a coincidence." Luo Fan looked at the martial emperor and said with a smile. Luo Fan was not the real Six Absolute Saint Clan. The Six Absolute Sacred Clans that were born in the Six Absolute Nebula were unable to completely enter the world of the Six Absolute Sacred Clans. Therefore, even though he could see the world of the Six Absolute Sacred Clans, and even had his figure in the world, he was unable to do so. But in the outside world, in the boundless fog, his figure still existed. It was as if he was in two different worlds at the same time. It was precisely because of this that he did not need to leave the world without the slightest bit of fog and countless strange creatures to be able to freely converse with the martial emperor. The martial emperor naturally could not take Luo Fan's humble words seriously. He only smiled bitterly and did not say anything else. "Brother Wu, do you want to see the real Six Absolute Nebula?" Luo Fan looked at the martial emperor's completely relaxed appearance and said with a smile, "The real Six Absolute Nebula?" The martial emperor could not help but be surprised and repeated the words. Luo Fan smiled slightly and nodded. He said, "That's right. Naturally, I couldn't ask for more." How could the martial emperor still be polite when he heard Luo Fan nod his head? Luo Fan nodded. He raised his hand and pointed. A surge of energy was emitted from his finger and instantly enveloped the martial emperor. The surge of energy was not powerful, but its essence was extremely high. The profoundness contained within it was complex and profound to a level that the martial emperor could not imagine. The moment the martial monarch sensed this force, he understood that if Luo Fan wanted to, such a force would absolutely be able to easily crush him into powder, causing his body to dissipate, and his soul to collapse. Thus he would die, his Tao would vanish, and his soul would disperse. However, even though he was shocked by the power of such a surge of energy, he did not feel any fear or doubt because of it. Instead, he calmly spread his arms and endured the energy without holding anything back. This was because the surge of energy was emitted by Luo Fan, and with his friendship with Luo Fan, he definitely did not believe that Luo Fan would harm him. Luo Fan was not the slightest bit surprised by the martial emperor's actions, nor did he feel touched. To him, the martial emperor's behavior was completely within his expectations. Ever since he went into closed-door cultivation and asked the martial emperor to protect him, he knew that the martial emperor's behavior would definitely be like this. Why would he feel touched when he had long since treated it as a normal behavior? After the surge of energy enveloped the martial emperor, it shook slightly and shifted the martial emperor's figure slightly. It changing at an extremely profound rhythm. As the changes occurred, the world that the martial emperor saw instantly changed. The boundless fog disappeared in an instant, and was replaced by a boundless void. In the void there were countless strange creatures. The martial emperor's eyes were filled with shock as he looked at the world that had changed drastically in an instant. So this is the Six Absolute Nebula, he mumbled. He felt as if a whole new world had opened up before him. The martial emperor was in existence at the perfection realm after all. Although his senses were far inferior to Luo Fan's, who had become an exterminator, he was still quite sharp. At the very least, although his senses towards rules and principles were not as clear as Luo Fan's, it was not as if he could not sense them. Therefore, after noticing the changes in the world in front of him, he carefully observed and sensed for a while before he knew why there were such changes. He knew that he was currently standing on a node of rules and principles, which was why he could see such a world. For a moment, he could not help but feel endless emotions. The real difference between me and Brother Luo is not the difference in cultivation, but the difference in thinking. These things, if I were more careful, I would have been able to discover them, but I only discovered it after Brother Luo showed it to me. I am truly ashamed. Naturally, he did not say these emotions out loud. With a thought, he slightly adjusted his figure, following the rhythm of Luo Fan's power that enveloped her, or rather, following the rhythm of the node's rotation, she actively changed her figure. Luo Fan sensed this passive and active change. Knowing that the martial emperor no longer needed to be carried into the Six Absolute Holy Clans world, he raised his hand and waved. He had already retracted the power that enveloped the martial emperor. These beings are the same species as the ones that attacked you before. They call themselves the Six Absolute Holy Clan. However, I think the Six Absolute Demon Clan is a more suitable name. Luo Fan pointed at the strange being that was hiding in the distance and watching carefully. After being pointed at by Luo Fan, the creature immediately shrank back, turned around, and ran far away. For these beings, Luo Fan was the strongest demon. If they accidentally offended him, it would be a disaster. They had no choice but to be careful, and they had no choice but to be fearful. The martial emperor looked at the being that had an unfathomable form and could not help but sigh. The mysteries of the world's creation are indeed not something that we can fully comprehend. To think that such a mysterious being would be born in such a dangerous nebula. It's really mysterious. Luo Fan chuckled, and after acknowledging that it was so, he changed the topic and said, "Brother Wu, you should properly comprehend the mysteries of this Six Absolute Nebula. Wait for me to carefully search, then I will destroy this Six Absolute Nebula." "Go ahead, Brother Luo," said the martial emperor with a smile. As he spoke, he extended his perception in all directions, trying to sense the profundities of the Six Absolute Demon Race's world. Since he had already discovered the laws and the giant web of laws, the focus of his perception was naturally the giant web. Soon, he discovered the difference in the position that was connected to the crystal stone, and he shifted his gaze there to carefully examine it. This should be the key, thought the martial emperor, and his admiration for Luo Fan grew stronger. He had a preconceived notion that there would definitely be something strange about this position, which was why he was able to discover the key. However, Luo Fan was able to find it from nothing. The difference in difficulty was like the difference between heaven and earth. How could the martial emperor not admire Luo Fan? Naturally, Luo Fan did not know what the martial emperor was thinking. Even if he knew, he would not care at all. At this moment, he was carefully sensing all the changes in the 6 absolute nebula, and he was carefully searching for a way to destroy it. There were all sorts of divine abilities and daos in Luo Fan's mind. There were so many that it was impossible to describe them with numbers. Soon, he found the key. As expected, the key to destroying the 6 absolute nebula was this position. However, the way to destroy the entire 6 absolutes nebula was not to destroy the laws and nomological structure of this location. If he did that, he would be able to divert this key point and condense another key point in the 6 absolutes nebula. On the contrary, in order to destroy the 6 absolute nebula, he had to add countless laws and the structure of laws in this position, and then through this key point, the 6 absolute nebula would spread out and affect every inch of the 6 absolute nebula. He allowed the rules and the structure of the nomological laws to spread out and affect every inch of the void of the entire 6 absolute nebula. In the end, with such a change, the entire 6 absolute nebula would collapse from the inside out due to the change in nature, vanishing without a trace. After thinking it through, he smiled and turned to look at the martial emperor. He saw that the martial emperor's eyes were in a daze, and there seemed to be countless complicated and mysterious lines flashing in the depths of his pupils. In an instant, he knew that the martial emperor was comprehending the mysteries of the 6 absolute nebula. More accurately, he was comprehending the core of the 6 absolute nebula, the mystery of the key point where Luo Fan had destroyed the 6 absolute nebula. Seeing this, Luo Fan naturally gave up on the idea of immediately destroying the 6 absolute nebula. He directly sat down cross-legged in the void and spread his perception outwards. He carefully sensed the entire 6 absolute nebula, comprehending the laws and mysteries of the 6 absolute nebula, and carefully examining the fundamental principles behind it. This process, for Luo Fan, who was already an exterminator, there were endless benefits. This could allow him to continuously enter the extermination realm, allowing him to better understand the world he saw after becoming an exterminator. It allowed him to slowly advance towards the next realm of the extermination realm, the void comprehending realm. Of course, it hadn't been long since he became an exterminator. It was impossible for him to truly become a void comprehending realm in a short period of time. Although this method would help him become a void comprehending realm expert, it wouldn't be much. This was also the fundamental reason why he decided to step into this process after seeing the martial emperor comprehending the mysteries of the 6 absolute nebula. Time passed slowly. In the blink of an eye, a year had passed. During this year, not a single Khanate Grand Luo cultivator had found this location, and not a single 6 absolute demon clan dared to approach this place, even the central sacred land. In this year, it had become a dead land. No 6 absolute demon clan remained here. No 6 absolute demon clan dared to resist Luo Fan, who could easily destroy the Lord of Destruction. On this day, the martial emperor's body shook, and he raised his hand. The void distorted slightly. A ripple that isolated the 6 senses spread out as he moved. It was clear that he had comprehended a martial art that could isolate the 6 senses of his opponent during this year of comprehending the 6 absolute nebula. The martial emperor's movement seemed ordinary, but the effect it produced was earth-shattering. There were even layers of spatial ripples that spread out in all directions. It was clear that this martial art wasn't ordinary. After executing the martial art once, the martial emperor retracted his hand. A faint smile appeared on his face, and he let out a long sigh of relief. When the martial emperor made this move, Luo Fan's body shook, and he awoke from the process of sensing all the changes in the 6 absolute nebula. He turned to look at the martial emperor, and he knew that the martial emperor had gained a lot. He couldn't help but smile, and he said, "Congratulations. It's just a small gain. I'm ashamed that I've delayed Brother Luo's progress." The martial emperor could tell that Luo Fan hadn't destroyed the 6 absolute nebula because he was waiting for him. He couldn't help but feel embarrassed. Luo Fan shook his head and he said, "There's no need to say that. Even though I've delayed you a little, I've also gained a lot." He wasn't lying. In truth, Luo Fan hadn't gained nothing from comprehending the 6 absolute nebula in the past year. At the very least, he had gained a deep understanding of the profundities of the 6 absolute nebula. With such a deep understanding, it might not be possible for him to create another 6 absolute nebula. However, it allowed him to slightly distort the laws within a certain range, and construct it into something similar to the void within the 6 absolute nebula, isolating the 6 senses of all living beings. In fact, because it was targeted, and because it was controlled by Luo Fan, the isolation effect could even prevent it from being weakened by great perfection magic treasures, and it could be used on cultivators with great perfection magic treasures. To Luo Fan, this might just be the icing on the cake. After all, with the power of Luo Fan's abilities, he could easily deal with those who were weaker than him without using such a method, and it would be difficult for such a method to be effective against those who were stronger than him. However, this kind of comprehension allowed Luo Fan to have a deeper understanding of the world he saw after becoming a Terminator. He was able to distinguish the effects of many laws, and it could be said that he had made a slight progress towards the void comprehension realm. However, it could be considered a great gain. The martial emperor only nodded and did not refute him. Luo Fan knew that the martial emperor would not take it to heart, so he did not continue to explain. With a thought, he raised his hand and threw the crystal stone in his hand towards the crucial location. The crystal stone originally had an extremely close connection with this crucial position. When it was thrown, it naturally felt an indescribable mysterious traction effect, naturally stabilizing that position. There was not the slightest bit of slanting, nor was there the slightest bit of incompatibility. Luo Fan had already expected this, and did not hesitate. He raised his hand and pointed at the crystal stone. Endless power poured into the crystal stone, instantly dispersing the faintly discernible vortex within the crystal stone. At this moment, the entire 6 absolute nebula shook violently. There seemed to be some kind of change happening, and some extremely powerful destructive force was brewing. To be continued. Chapter 860. Luo Fan's energy didn't stop pouring into the whirlpool. Instead, he poured his energy into the whirlpool even more ferociously. Book Network, as his energy poured in, the whirlpool inside the crystal became more and more chaotic. After a short while, when the whirlpool reached a certain limit, a strange order appeared. As soon as this order appeared, it led all the specks of light that formed the vortex to turn into countless tiny threads. They suddenly exploded and rushed out of the crystal, pouring into the void where the crystal was located. They directly fused with the laws and the giant net of laws, constantly attacking and squeezing it. As the battering and compressing continued, the giant net of laws began to fluctuate violently. Amidst the fluctuations, the entire 6 absolute nebula began to change. The gray mist that was originally evenly distributed in every inch of the 6 absolute nebula began to become uneven. In some areas, the gray mist became 1,000 times denser than before, and in some areas, the mist disappeared completely. Such a change was naturally reflected in the world where the 6 absolute demon race lived. In an instant, the world began to shatter. Some areas suddenly expanded, and some areas were completely cut off by a void that didn't even have space. The changes became more and more intense, and more terrifying. Out of the countless 6 absolute demon race living in this world, billions of them were instantly separated from this world and appeared in the outside world where there was no mist. Such a careless appearance should have been easily noticed by other Sciention Grand Luo cultivators, but at this moment, those Sciention Grand Luo cultivators couldn't be bothered to pay attention to the 6 absolute demon race. Unlike the 6 absolute demon race, they didn't treat the 6 absolute nebula as a real world. Instead, they knew that the 6 absolute nebula in front of them was just a projection. It was a projection of a forbidden land in the future. No matter how real it was just a checkpoint on the Bridge of Eras. Combined with the various experiences they had gained from the 3,333 checkpoints. As soon as they saw the changes in front of them, they instantly understood that they had reached the end of this checkpoint. Under such circumstances, why would they care about the 6 absolute demon race? Luo Fan's eyes shone brightly as the power within his body surged into the crystal before him. Under the urging of his power, countless threads continuously burst out of the crystal and merged with the surrounding laws and the giant web of laws, causing the laws and laws to constantly deform. At this moment, an indescribably powerful pressure suddenly descended upon him from nothingness. The strength of this pressure had reached an unimaginable level. It was as if the entire universe, the entire world, was rejecting him, wanting to completely erase him from the endless void and even the endless time. Luo Fan was very familiar with this kind of oppression. His experience from the previous 3,000 checkpoints made him instantly understand that this was the 6 absolute nebula's resistance. This meant that what he had done was absolutely correct. His method was indeed able to destroy the 6 absolute nebula. Understanding this, he did not hold back anymore, and the energy that was poured into the crystal stone became faster and faster. As for the powerful pressure that descended from the void, to him it was nothing at all. If Luo Fan was only a Khanate Grand Luo, he might have felt troubled by this pressure, and would need to use some means to resist it. However, he was already an exterminator, and this pressure couldn't even shake his body or his mind, so he naturally didn't need to pay any attention to it. The changes in the surroundings grew greater, and the entire giant web of laws became more and more chaotic. It seemed like it had reached a certain limit and was about to be destroyed. At this moment, an incomparably huge human figure appeared out of thin air in front of Luo Fan. This human figure had the appearance of a middle-aged man. He was tens of thousands of feet tall, and his body emitted an extremely powerful aura. As he stood there, he naturally collided with the surrounding void, causing it to distort. There were even countless fine cracks that covered the void. The human figure's eyes were blank. After taking form, he raised his hands together as if he was holding a treasure bottle, and slammed it down at Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan only felt that an entire universe had descended from the sky, and was about to completely erase him. The void in front of the huge human figure's hands shattered into pieces, and countless spatial powder was swept out in all directions by the hands. It created a fog-like effect. The tens of thousands of feet tall human figure was in the form of a shadow. Although it emitted a substantial aura, one could tell at a glance that it wasn't a real living being, but a strange existence that seemed to be condensed. It seemed to be power, rules, and laws. That was none other than the mysterious existence that the entire 6 absolute nebula had condensed out of instinct to stop Luo Fan from destroying his body. Of course, such a mysterious existence was only a force in Luo Fan's eyes. After all, the world view of power treated everything as power, and the only difference was the composition of the power, and the profoundness contained within it. Luo Fan's expression didn't change in the face of the attack condensed by all the power of the entire 6 Absolute Nebula. In terms of quantity, Luo Fan was naturally far inferior to such an attack. In comparison, it would be an exaggeration to say that Luo Fan was an ant. However, such an attack was naturally condensed by the 6 Absolute Nebula. It wasn't a real living being, but a real cultivator condensed it. In terms of quantity, it was indeed earth-shattering. However, it didn't contain enough willpower, so it couldn't perfectly unleash its destructive power. In other words, it couldn't completely concentrate its destructive power on Luo Fan. Instead, it seemed extremely scattered. Although the momentum of such an attack was unparalleled, it was not a fatal attack to Luo Fan, who was at the exterminator level. In the face of such an attack, he naturally didn't need to show any signs of panic. With a slight thought, the power around him surged. In an instant, thousands of completely different powers condensed around him, forming a streamlined shield that completely protected his body. At the same time, the speed at which he channeled power into the crystal stone became faster and faster. Under this channeling, the surrounding nomological laws finally reached a certain limit. It was beyond what it could bear. In an instant, starting from the crystal stone, countless tiny cracks spread in all directions. In a short while, they had swept through every inch of the void of the 6 Absolute Nebula. These cracks became more and more obvious. They became denser and denser. In the end, the entire 6 Absolute Nebula instantly collapsed, turning into countless incomparably tiny fragments like smoke, shrouding an extremely vast area of the void. At this moment, countless cracks also appeared on the huge humanoid shadow. After all, it was condensed by the 6 Absolute Nebula, and its foundation was still above the 6 Absolute Nebula. At this moment, this foundation had been completely destroyed by Luo Fan, so it was impossible for it to remain unharmed. Of course, although the foundation had been turned into powder, it hadn't completely disappeared. Therefore, although the humanoid shadow had countless cracks, as if it could collapse at any time, it didn't completely collapse. However, after all, he did not completely collapse. He raised his hands and continued to attack Luo Fan. Crack! An earth-shattering thunderclap sounded when the hands hit the shield formed by thousands of powers around Luo Fan's body. Endless and terrifying destructive power crazily poured into Luo Fan's body through the shield. Luo Fan's terrifyingly strong body was instantly shattered, almost instantly turning into powder. At this moment, the 10,000-foot-tall humanoid shadow finally couldn't maintain its form anymore. With a loud bang, it instantly turned into smoke and scattered in all directions like it was made of sand. It was because the 6 Absolute Nebula had been completely destroyed, and its foundation had been completely destroyed. The humanoid shadow finally couldn't exist anymore. The destructive power of the gigantic figure was earth-shattering. However, the 6 Absolute Nebula had already been shattered into countless pieces of space during the process of its descent. As a result, its power had been weakened by who knew how many times. When it struck the barrier, 99% of its power had been dissipated by the barrier. In the end, the remaining portion was used on Luo Fan. Even if its original power was enough to destroy the heavens and extinguish the earth, after being weakened, when it reached Luo Fan's body, it only made Luo Fan's body become fragmented. Towards his divine soul, his thoughts, to his spirit, his will, it only caused some impact, but it didn't cause any damage to them. On the other hand, his spirit, will were not damaged. Even if his body was shattered, it would only take a thought for Luo Fan to recover, seeing that the 6 Absolute Nebula had already changed. The surrounding void and the figures of the innate Daluo realm cultivators gradually materialized. Clearly, it was the next stage. The 3,335th stage had already appeared. Luo Fan wanted to recover his shattered body. At this moment, an indescribably powerful force suddenly poured into Luo Fan's body from nowhere. This force was unimaginably powerful, and it could even completely wipe out any innate Daluo realm cultivator. After pouring into Luofan's body, it did not wreak havoc on Luofan's body. However, it did not have any intention of taming him either. Instead, it kept seeping into the depths of his body. Even Luofan's will could not resist such penetration, and the nature of his body was constantly being changed by this force. This power was even transmitted to the location of his spirit through his mind, constantly seeping into the depths of his spirit. It was also trying to change the nature of his spirit. This must be the backlash. Such a thought flashed through Luofan's will. He did not have time to recover his body, so he gathered all of his will and began to comprehend and control that force. This clone of Luofan's was a body of power. Its original form was the power of an innate Daluo. After becoming an innate Daluo, he even cultivated the inheritance of great strength Dao Lord and turned his worldview into a worldview of power. His control over power was so strong that it was incomparable to any cultivator who cultivated other Daos. To other innate Daluo realm cultivators, such a mysterious force that came from a strange source might be absolutely impossible to resist. However, to him, he had thousands of ways to deal with it even though it was all in a hurry. In the process of comprehending the mysteries, this force was still constantly seeping into the depths of his soul. However, its speed began to slow down due to the changes in his will. Meanwhile, the mysteries of the force were gradually revealed in front of Luofan during this process. It was the Six Absolutes power. It was the intrinsic power of the Six Absolutes nebula. It contained all the mysteries of the Six Absolutes nebula, and even the mysteries of the rules and laws within it. By mastering such a force, he could create another Six Absolutes nebula at any time. It was not like the method that Luofan comprehended to create a similar Six Absolutes domain. Instead, it was a complete and boundless Six Absolutes nebula. If one could not control such a force and allowed it to invade the depths of one's spirit, it would change the nature of one's spirit. Then, even Luofan would be completely changed by such a force. In the beginning, he would be changed into an extremely powerful Six Absolutes demon. Then, as the force took effect, the Six Absolutes demon would gradually grow bigger. In the end, when it reached a certain limit, it would collapse and turn into a Six Absolutes nebula, recreating the scene of the 3,334 stages. Of course, such a force was just a force in Luofan's eyes, but it was not the case for other cultivators. This was because such a force was, in fact, a force in a broad sense. It was because Luofan regarded everything as a force that he regarded as a force. In reality, however, it was something that contained rules, laws, boundless information, and boundless origin chi. It was a strange existence that contained countless other mysterious existences that could not be described with words. How could they treat such an existence as a force? If they had to describe it, perhaps it could only be described as the origin of the Six Absolutes nebula. Naturally, Luofan was not someone else. To him this was a force with a mysterious nature that contained the origin of the Six Absolutes nebula. This kind of power was immensely beneficial to him. If he could completely comprehend the profoundness within it, he would definitely be able to use it. If he could fully comprehend the profundities within it, it would greatly enrich the power in his body. It would allow his cultivation, which had stagnated for a long time, to grow. Although it could not allow him to break through to the ninth order of the immortal realm immediately, it would allow his cultivation to take a huge step forward, and he would be able to obtain great benefits. With a thought, Luofan already understood the nature of this force. He could not help but be overjoyed. The power in his body that was close to the origin of power trembled slightly. Its nature underwent a huge change, and the aura of the Six Absolutes nebula seeped out. After the change in nature, the force suddenly turned and instantly seeped into his mind, into his sea of consciousness, and then wrapped around his spirit. It chased after the force, and continued to enter the depths of his spirit. His force was cultivated by himself, and it was in his spirit. Under such circumstances, the speed at which his force penetrated was naturally far faster than the external force. Naturally, it caught up with the external force very quickly, and directly wrapped around it. If it was any other force, when it wrapped around the external force, due to the conflict of nature, there would definitely be a huge impact. It would produce an effect similar to an explosion, and it might directly blow up Luo Fan's spirit. However, after Luo Fan had changed this force, it had already emitted the aura of the Six Absolutes Nebula. Its nature had also become extremely compatible with the external force. Therefore, when the two energies came into contact, although they didn't completely fuse, there wasn't any intense collision. Although the force was extremely powerful, it was also the same as the human figure that resisted the Six Absolutes Nebula before. There was no will in it. It was difficult to fully exert its power. If one wanted to stop it, it did not need the same great power. As long as one used a delicate enough method, one could distort the direction of the force and guide it away from his spirit. And Luo Fan did the same. His power produced millions of changes in an instant. In an instant, it had already changed the direction of the external force, and directly led the force out of his spirit, out of his sea of consciousness, and then out of his mind. Then, it directly left his body, and condensed into a crystal ball in front of him. It seemed to contain the mysteries of everything in the universe. This ball was the size of a football. There were millions of changes and evolutions in it at all times, and there were countless strange sounds coming from it at every moment. This power was guided by Luo Fan's power, which allowed it to leave his body and condense into a ball. Therefore, although it no longer continued to drill into his body, Luo Fan still used his power to envelop it. He still did not dare to relax. Before he could observe and comprehend the crystal ball of energy, Luo Fan's mind moved slightly, and his body that was originally shattered instantly returned to normal. It seemed as if he had never been injured. Although having his body torn apart wasn't a serious injury to him, it was still an injury. Naturally, he couldn't just leave it there and do nothing. After recovering from his injuries, he looked around and noticed that the many innate Daluo realm cultivators around him were looking at him with a strange expression. His expression seemed to be filled with fear, rejoicing, and even more so, worry. Obviously, they could not control their emotions from being able to make Luo Fan look like this at the 3334th stage. To be continued. To see the latest chapter of the Extraordinary Primeval World, please search on Baidu or enter directly. Chapter 861. It wasn't appropriate for the other Golden Immortal Realm cultivators to speak, but the relationship between the Martial Emperor and Luo Fan was especially different, so he was naturally the one to speak. First published, the Martial Emperor immediately asked, "Brother Luo, may I know what's the taboo of destroying this test, and will the following tests be like this as well?" Luo Fan naturally knew that this was the question that everyone had in common, so he didn't beat around the bush and grinned as he said, "Even though this forbidden area isn't as vast and grand as the last era, the projection is countless times more realistic than the projection of the entire era in the previous tests. When this forbidden area is destroyed, the resistance of this forbidden area wouldn't be inferior to the resistance of the projection of the entire era in the previous tests. Besides that, after this forbidden area is destroyed, the quintessence of this forbidden area will invade the person who destroyed it, and it's just like the backlash from the information when the projection of the era was destroyed. If one's unable to endure it, then one would be completely assimilated by the quintessence and lose oneself. As for what the following tests are like, I don't know. But I presume it's probably similar." Even though he didn't directly answer the Martial Emperor's question about the taboo of the forbidden area of destruction, his words had already explained the answer that everyone wanted to know. The numerous golden immortal realm cultivators present here weren't puzzled by Luo Fan's simple answer, and they'd understood how special the tests in the forbidden area were instead. After they understood this, the expressions of all the golden immortal realm cultivators and even the martial emperor changed greatly. After they'd experienced over 3,000 tests from before, they'd long since become clearly aware of how formidable and unbelievable the backlash from the final information from the projection of the era was. Golden immortal realm cultivators like them were utterly unable to endure the backlash from the boundless information, and even the strongest martial emperor would be completely lost beneath the backlash. The reason why they were able to recover from the information backlash was that they were able to do so. Although the information backlash was shocking, it didn't have too much destructive power. It couldn't burst their divine souls in an instant, and it couldn't destroy them. They had a long time to find clues from the endless information. Then they would be able to sort out the information. However, according to what Luo Fan said, the backlash from the following tests wasn't just information, but the quintessence of the forbidden area instead. It wasn't just information. It also contained boundless yuan qi, boundless energy, boundless laws, and the fundamental source of laws. That was an existence that absolutely had the power to wipe out all living beings, an existence that possessed absolute explosive destructive power. If the strength of such a fundamental origin was as strong as the final information backlash of the past projection checkpoint, none of them would be able to withstand such a backlash. He would definitely be instantly assimilated by the backlash of the fundamental origin. Such a fact. This meant that even if they did their best in this trial, and were the first to find the core and have the qualifications to destroy the trial, they would not be able to destroy the forbidden area. He was unable to obtain the benefits of breaking through the checkpoint of the forbidden area. How could they maintain their composure in this situation? Luo Fan stood there, looking at everyone's expressions. He knew what they were thinking. He faintly smiled and said, "Although it is difficult to defend against the origin source, it is impossible to resist it. However, if he was able to completely refine and absorb it, then he would naturally be able to completely obtain the essence of the forbidden area and comprehend the grand Tao contained within it. Presumably, this is an extremely rare opportunity for all of you, fellow Taoists." As soon as Luo Fan's words entered their ears, the eyes of these connate golden immortal realm cultivators lit up. In an instant, the disappointment was replaced by fighting spirit. A forbidden land must contain boundless nomological laws. It must be a manifestation of a certain aspect of the great Tao. If they could obtain it completely, it would be extremely beneficial to them. It was not just a rare opportunity, it was a great blessing. After all, even though everyone present here was a connate golden immortal realm cultivator that had arrived at an extremely profound forbidden area, it could be said that every single one of them had encountered a bottleneck in their cultivation. Under such circumstances, even if the great Tao contained in those forbidden lands was not complete and was not universally applicable, it was still a huge boost to their cultivation. There was even a high possibility that it could directly break through the bottleneck they were currently facing. It was obvious how tempting such a fact was to connate golden immortal realm cultivators like them. With such enormous benefits in front of them, even if they were clearly aware that they were absolutely unable to endure the backlash from the quintessence of the forbidden area and would definitely be completely assimilated by it, they were still unwilling to give up. Instead, they aroused the thought of finding some special techniques to allow themselves to endure this sort of backlash. Even though connate golden immortal realm cultivators were unable to truly attain omnipotence. But if they knew what their objective was, then any connate golden immortal realm cultivator would more or less be able to find some methods to accomplish it. Of course, it was difficult to say if these methods were complicated, if they took many detours, or if they were unnecessary. For example, if a connate golden immortal realm cultivator wanted to turn back time and return to the past, then they were able to accomplish it through various methods. However, to connate golden immortal realm cultivators that didn't have a deep understanding of the essence of space, perhaps they would have to exhaust a myriad of materials and prepare for over 1,000,000 or even 1,000,000,000,000 years before they could accomplish it. They were even able to accomplish traversing through time without any foundation, let alone anything else. For example, resisting the backlash from the quintessence of the forbidden area was obviously the same for them. If they were willing to disregard the price, then any one of them would be able to accomplish it. It was just that different cultivators used different methods with different prices. The reason they were disappointed when they didn't know what benefits the quintessence brought to them was because they felt that the price they paid wasn't proportional to the benefits they obtained. It caused them to be unwilling to pay that price, and they were even more willing to give up on it. When he saw the numerous connate golden immortal realm cultivators were filled with fighting spirit, Luo Fan understood that they would absolutely not be filled with negative emotions anymore. With a command in his heart, he raised his hand and pointed forward. The sphere formed from the 6 absolutes nebula rumbled before instantly exploding into pieces. It transformed into a strange gray mist that covered an area of 300 m, and it surged before Luo Fan. The gray mist was extremely profound. It contained boundless laws, and even boundless energy. It was even to the extent that there were countless living beings within it. Shockingly, it was the appearance of the 6 Absolutes Nebula. After the miniature version of the 6 Absolutes Nebula appeared, Luo Fan didn't hold back at all. He released his own energy and continuously poured it into the miniature version of the 6 Absolutes Nebula. He constantly assimilated it, causing the miniature version of the 6 Absolutes Nebula to seem like it was constantly melting during the process. It was shrinking at a rapid speed. Every single one of the connate golden immortal realm cultivators present had lived for hundreds of millions of years. Naturally, they could tell what Luo Fan was doing with a single glance. However, their expressions changed slightly. Among them, the majority of the changes in their expressions were those of envy. Even the remaining small portion revealed a pained and regretful expression. Because at this very moment, Luo Fan's actions were clearly using an extremely direct and violent method to absorb the essence of the 6 Absolutes Nebula. He was comprehending the part of the Grand Tao contained within the essence of the 6 Absolutes Nebula. Such a method was simple, direct, and fast. It was something that everyone was envious of. However, such a method would also cause irreversible damage to the essence of the 6 Absolutes Nebula. Using such a method, when Luo Fan completely comprehended the profundities of the Grand Tao contained within, it would also be the time when the essence of the 6 Absolutes Nebula completely dissipated. Naturally, Luo Fan didn't care about the changes in their expressions. At this very moment, he felt as if he had turned into a god of creation. All the profundities of the entire 6 Absolutes Nebula were displayed in his eyes at an unimaginable speed. It made him feel as if his understanding of the Grand Tao was rapidly improving at every moment. Even his cultivation realm was rising at an unimaginable speed during this process. Previously, when he used the crystal to sense the entire 6 Absolutes Nebula, although he could also sense everything within the 6 Absolutes Nebula, that feeling was completely different from what he was feeling right now. At that time, what he sensed was more of the surface situation. Or rather, it was just the effect of the countless laws interacting with each other. It was also extremely profound. It greatly benefited him, allowing him to have a deeper understanding of the characteristics of the various laws. And at this very moment what he felt, it was completely from the inside out, directly penetrating into the essence of the 6 Absolutes Nebula. It directly penetrated into the Grand Tao hidden behind the countless laws and laws. It directly spread out in front of him, unfolded and turned into his own. The difference between the two. It was the difference between knowing how it is and knowing why it is. During this process, An endless stream of information flowed through his mind and mind. Then it was absorbed into the depths of his own memory. In a short span of half a day, the miniature version of the Six Absolutes Nebula with a radius of 100 feet had been completely absorbed by Luo Fan. It completely disappeared in front of everyone as if it had never appeared. At the moment when the miniature Six Absolutes Nebula disappeared, a muffled sound suddenly came from Luo Fan's body. These muffled sounds seemed as if there were hundreds of millions of thunderbolts raging wildly in his body. It also seemed as if there were thousands of worlds being opened up in his body in an instant. Along with this muffled sound, Luo Fan's aura wasn't suppressed in the slightest. His aura, which hadn't been revealed in the slightest, rapidly soared, and directly soared into the sky, spreading in all directions. This aura was getting stronger and more terrifying. In the beginning, it only shocked the numerous innate golden immortal realm cultivators. Later on, it even caused all of them to feel as if they'd fallen into the toughest substance in the entire universe. Boundless pressure pressed down upon them and restricted them, causing them to feel as if even the slightest breath would exhaust their entire strength. They had to endure the pressure of this imposing aura at any moment and the danger of being crushed into powder that poured down upon them like a torrential downpour. Did he break through? Such a thought appeared in everyone's mind. Luo Fan's performance was clearly the result of breaking through a tough shackle in his cultivation. It was an extremely shocking breakthrough, and it would only appear when he was temporarily unable to control the change in his aura. So, how could they not know what was happening to Luo Fan? Such a thought made their feelings unimaginably complicated. When they first met Luo Fan's cultivation was only below average among them. However, when they met for the second time after over 200,000 years, Luo Fan had already surpassed them. Of course, at that time, they were still able to sense that while Luo Fan was stronger than them, there wasn't much of a gap between them in terms of essence. In other words, Luo Fan was just a connate grand heavenly realm cultivator like them at that time. And after that, the process of breaking through was very difficult. Luo Fan improved at an unimaginable speed, and in a short period of a few hundred years, he'd already allowed the essence of his life to attain transcendence, causing these connate golden immortal realm cultivators like them to be inferior to ants before him. Such speed. It was already sufficient to shock them to the point of being speechless. However, at this moment, Luo Fan had actually made a huge breakthrough on top of such a foundation. How unbelievable was this situation, and how earth-shattering was his cultivation speed. How could they accept it calmly? Right now, Luo Fan had indeed obtained a huge breakthrough, just as many connate grand heavenly realm cultivators thought. After completely absorbing the essence of the Six Absolute Nebula, the boundless information that Luo Fan obtained from the projection of the previous 3,333 eras surfaced once again. Along with the various mysteries he had just obtained, it created an indescribable force that pushed his cultivation realm to directly break through the barrier between the 8th and 9th level of the celestial realm, allowing his cultivation realm to instantly rise from the 8th level of the celestial realm to the 9th level of the celestial realm. Although the difference between the peak of the 8th level of the celestial realm and the 9th level of the celestial realm seemed insignificant, but the gap between the two was like a chasm. After breaking through this barrier, the power in his body instantly increased by 1,000 times, and it was endless. He had received it indirectly in the past, intentionally or unintentionally. However, he did not completely master it. The principles related to power were instantly absorbed by him, and they completely fused into his instincts. This in turn affected the power in his body, allowing the power in his body to take another step forward towards the source of power. This kind of improvement made his power even more mysterious. There were more wondrous uses, and it became easier and more exciting to use. The transformation into other powers also became smoother. Faintly, he could even sense some kind of boundless and mysterious power beyond the universe. How mysterious was that power? In Luo Fan's senses, that power only needed a strand the size of a strand of hair to be able to directly transform the entire boundless world. Just a small strand the size of a thumb would be able to directly transform into a universe that was no smaller than the universe on Earth. The moment he sensed that power, Luo Fan understood that this was the state of chaos. Or rather, it was the power of chaos in the world of power. This kind of feeling was faintly discernible, seemingly illusory yet real, seemingly existing yet not existing. There was no way to clearly sense it, and it was even more impossible to rely on such a feeling to comprehend this power. Even so, Luo Fan was indescribably overjoyed. He even felt inexplicably touched. This was the first time he had clearly understood a point of view in the world of power. Everything was composed of power, and even the state of chaos was composed of power. This meant that there was nothing wrong with the method he cultivated. This incarnation of his consciousness was indeed on the correct path to transcendence. Even in the past, he had been extremely confident about this and believed that the path he took would not be wrong. However, it was only now that he had concrete evidence to prove this point. Only now could he confidently declare this to any living being. The aura that filled the world on Luo Fan's body lasted for 15 minutes before gradually receding. When all of his aura was completely receded, Luo Fan no longer looked any different from before. He was also like an ordinary person. It was impossible to tell that the terrifying aura from before came from his body, and it was impossible to tell that he was so powerful. He let out a long sigh of relief, and a happy smile appeared on his face. He raised his head and looked at the sky. His gaze pierced through space and time, as if he could see the entire world around him. His cultivation realm had risen to the 9th stage of celestial realm. Although he had just stepped into it, it also meant that his cultivation realm and the comprehension of the annihilation realm were one step closer. It meant that he could more easily comprehend the annihilation realm. It meant that he could break through the annihilation realm at a faster speed and reach the void comprehending realm. This naturally made him feel indescribably happy. "Congratulations on your great progress, Brother Luo," the martial emperor said with a rather complicated expression as he went up. The friendship between the martial emperor and Luo Fan could be said to be comparable to that of brothers. However, in the face of Luo Fan's huge breakthrough, he didn't know what to say. After all, the martial emperor had spent billions of years to reach his current cultivation realm, and the last time he improved was when he received Luo Fan's guidance and found his own path, the right direction to move forward. After that, even though he received a lot of care from Luo Fan, received a few dozen era projections information backlash, and obtained fortuitous encounters that other innate heavenly immortals did not have, his cultivation realm did not improve much. At most, he only strengthened his foundation. In comparison, Luo Fan advanced triumphantly. At the beginning, he was only slightly inferior to Luo Fan, but now, he could not even compare to an ant. Even though he had a special relationship with Luo Fan, he found it hard to accept such a speed of improvement. Even though it was not to the extent of jealousy or estrangement, he felt that it was difficult for him to face Luo Fan like before. Luo Fan's senses were so sharp that he knew what the martial emperor was thinking as soon as he spoke, and he could not help but sigh inwardly. Chapter 862. After sighing, Luo Fan said, "You're too kind, Brother Luo. I've obtained all the benefits from these 3,000 tests. Wouldn't I be like a piece of rotten wood if I didn't improve?" The martial emperor's expression remained unchanged when he heard Luo Fan, and a trace of understanding flashed through his eyes. He'd only obtained a few dozen era projections information backlash, yet he'd already obtained so many benefits that it shook his cultivation realm. Luo Fan had obtained over 3,000 era projections information backlash. Even though it was still too shocking, it wasn't incomprehensible after all. With this understanding, the martial emperor felt much better even though he knew that the gap between him and Luo Fan was still extremely huge. Right at this moment, the voice of the Bridge of the Era that hadn't appeared for a long time after the numerous Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators stepped into this place and entered their ears. It interrupted the numerous Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators' thoughts of talking to Luo Fan. This is the 3335th test, the Chaotic Starfield. The way to pass through this test is to destroy this starfield. Obviously, the Bridge of the Era's artifact spirit had been paying attention to everything that happened here since a long time ago. At this moment, when Luo Fan had completed his breakthrough, it finally spoke these words that the numerous Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators intended to say after they passed the 3334th test. The reason for this was naturally because Luo Fan had the qualifications to make it accommodate him now. As a destroyer, even though Luo Fan was slightly weaker than the Bridge of the Era, he could be considered to be on the same level as the Bridge of the Era. However, he was countless times stronger than the Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators in the eyes of the Bridge of the Era. So, it naturally treated him specially. The hearts of the numerous Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators jerked when they heard the voice of the Bridge of the Era, and boundless vigilance arose in their hearts. The Bridge of Eras had named the forbidden areas according to the names they had received at that time. Since this stage was called Chaotic Rebellion, it was clear that it was not that simple. The 6 absolute nebula from before had already made them suffer greatly. How could they underestimate a place that could be called chaos? The starfields of chaotic strife? Luo Fan thought to himself. He looked around and found himself surrounded by a boundless starry sky. It seemed to be in the same universe as Earth. If it wasn't for the treasure spirit's voice, people would have thought that this was a projection of an era. So that's how it is. Chaotic reversal, chaotic reversal. So, it's about reversing time and chaotic space. Luo Fan was an annihilator. His cultivation level had improved greatly due to his previous breakthrough. He could use the true meaning of annihilation more perfectly. Although he only glanced around casually, he saw many things that other Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators couldn't see. He saw some of the profound principles hidden on the surface of the void. By now, many of the Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators no longer had any doubts about Luo Fan's abilities. After hearing the treasure spirit's voice, most of them looked around but didn't see anything. They all turned their gazes to Luo Fan. Clearly, they were pinning their hopes on Luo Fan. Luo Fan's expression didn't change much, but all of the Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators present were extremely observant. In the instant that Luo Fan came to a realization, they realized that Luo Fan had already learned something. At that moment, Old Man Omniscient stepped forward. I wonder if fellow Taoist Luo Fan knows anything about the chaotic starfields? We've learned nothing, so I hope you'll be generous enough to enlighten us, fellow Taoist. We'll be of help in destroying this starfield. The other Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators' expressions changed slightly, but most of them had the same thoughts as Old Man Omniscient. They immediately bowed to Luo Fan, asking for guidance. Even the arrogant Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators, those who hadn't placed all their hopes on Luo Fan, didn't leave in disdain. Instead, they stayed where they were, listening without any awkwardness. Luo Fan didn't take their differing attitudes to heart. After all, giving them some pointers would be of great help in destroying the chaotic starfields. He smiled. You're too courteous, fellow Taoists. I wouldn't dare say I know anything about the chaotic starfields. I only know what the word chaotic means. I believe the word chaotic refers to the reversal of time and chaos of space. Reversal of time and chaos of space? The expressions of the many Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators, including the martial monarchs, changed drastically when they heard Luo Fan's nonchalant words. Time and space were the most mysterious existences in the world. For ordinary cultivators, it was something that they could not understand or sense at all. Connate Grand Luo realm cultivators like them were much stronger than ordinary cultivators, and they could sense the existence of time and space, but they couldn't completely transcend them. They, too, existed between space and time. Under such circumstances, any change in time and space would have a huge impact on them. For example, the flow of time on the Bridge of Eras was tens of thousands of times slower than the outside world. That was a headache for many Connate Grand Luo realm cultivators, and they couldn't come up with a good solution even now. But at this very moment, this checkpoint before them was actually a checkpoint that reversed time and distorted space. What sort of a vile situation was this? How could their faces not change as a result of this? Of course, the only one who looked slightly better was the spacewalker, the Void Maiden. After all, the spacewalker's abilities were related to time and space. She was an expert in the chaotic starfield. How should we deal with this? Old Man Tong Xiao asked, steeling himself. Even though he'd gained boundless knowledge and understood everything, this was the first time he'd ever come across a region that could reverse time and chaos of space. He didn't know how to deal with it. I'm ashamed. I didn't know. I'm no different from you, fellow Taoists. I don't know much about the chaotic starfields either. Luo Fan smiled bitterly. He wasn't lying. He'd only scanned his surroundings. It was already extremely rare for him to be able to glean some information about the chaotic starfield. There was no way he could know more, let alone how the Connate Grand Luo realm cultivators should deal with it. He had his own way of dealing with it, but only he could use it. Obviously, it wasn't something they wanted to hear. Old Man Tong Xiao couldn't help but look disappointed when he heard Luo Fan's words. However, there was a flash of light in his eyes. He didn't get an answer from Luo Fan. However, it also made him understand that Luo Fan wasn't omniscient, and there was a limit to what he knew. He wouldn't be able to see through things that they couldn't comprehend even after spending thousands of years. This situation, although they couldn't get an answer on how to break through the barrier, it also boosted their confidence. They felt that the gap between them and Luo Fan wasn't so great that they couldn't make up for it. The other Connate Grand Luo realm cultivators had similar reactions. It was clear that they all had the same mentality. Luo Fan only smiled when he saw the change in their eyes. He didn't take it to heart. However, I believe this starfield won't be too troublesome for you, fellow Taoists. With your abilities, I'm sure you'll be able to protect yourselves here. Even if you don't know where to start, you can search around like you would any other place. After all, this isn't the real chaotic starfields. It's just a projection. It doesn't matter where you're trapped. As long as you pass through the barrier, you'll return to where you started. Since everyone had already asked him, although he couldn't give them a direct answer, he had a suggestion. In truth, many Connate Grand Luo realm cultivators could think of such a suggestion. But when they heard what Luo Fan had said, they wanted to express their gratitude to Luo Fan. After that, they didn't say anything else and went their separate ways. The starfields of chaotic starfields were a strange place. Everyone was only a few hundred meters away, several thousand meters away, or even tens of thousands of miles away before they were swallowed up by the chaotic space and time. They disappeared from Luo Fan's sight. Among them was Emperor Wu. Although Emperor Wu and Luo Fan weren't friends, he was still a Connate Grand Luo realm cultivator with a strong will. He couldn't rely on Luo Fan for everything, but he didn't stay with Luo Fan to explore the starfields of chaotic starfield. After bidding farewell to Luo Fan, he left like the rest of the Connate Grand Luo realm cultivators to explore the starfields of chaotic starfields on his own. Luo Fan sighed as he watched them leave. He turned around and took a step forward. He crossed a distance of several dozen meters, and crashed into a nearby area where space and time were a little strange. Although he hadn't fully seen through the mysteries of the starfields of chaotic starfields, he was able to discern the nature of the place. Naturally, he was able to spot a location that was compatible with the nature of the starfields of chaotic starfield. This particular area of space and time was the closest thing he had seen to the nature of the starfields of Chaotic Starfield. As soon as he crashed into this area, he felt as if he had entered a ripple of space and time. Whether it was time or space, they existed in a way he'd never seen before. In a trance, he suddenly saw dozens of himself appear in front of him. It was as if dozens of mirrors had suddenly appeared in front of him. He was startled, and with a thought, an indescribable power of space and time emanated from his body. Like countless tentacles, they firmly grasped the changing space and time around him and held him in place. After he was secured, he discovered that the dozens of himself in front of him were real. There were no mirrors, and they weren't illusions. At this moment, the dozens of him were also looking at him with an extremely strange gaze. Their expressions, their eyes, were clearly the same as his own. They were astonished by his appearance, and found it difficult to comprehend. "This is me in a different time." In a trance, Luo Fan suddenly realized what kind of existence these people in front of him were. Just when he had this kind of enlightenment, he looked forward and discovered that the dozens of people in front of him also had expressions of enlightenment in their eyes. It was just that some of them had comprehended it rather quickly, while others had comprehended it rather slowly. But no matter how fast it was, they were able to comprehend it faster than Luo Fan. When he realized this, Luo Fan couldn't help but smile bitterly to himself. It seems that they're all me in the future. They've clearly experienced this scene long ago, but they thought of this fact faster. As Luo Fan smiled bitterly to himself, the dozens of himself in front of him didn't say anything. They just turned around and took a step forward. They flashed through mysterious trajectories, broke through space and time, and instantly disappeared in front of Luo Fan. Clearly, they didn't need to do anything here anymore. He watched as dozens of himself in the future appeared out of thin air and then disappeared. Luo Fan suddenly felt an extremely complicated emotion. He seemed to feel that it was absurd, but also mysterious, and he couldn't react. After a long while, he smiled and shook his head, extinguishing these messy emotions, and began to pay attention to his surroundings. Time and space existed in an extremely strange way. This way of existence was completely different from the normal world. It was completely different from the normal world. In the normal world, time was continuous and sequential, and space was orderly and smooth. However, the time here was warped and broken. On the other hand, space was chaotic and fluctuating indeterminately. Such a space. It seemed to be extremely strange and chaotic. If Luo Fan hadn't taken time and space to be a type of energy to comprehend since a long time ago, and he'd even fused their nature into the energy within his body that was almost like the source of energy, then he would probably be utterly unable to maintain his freedom in such chaotic space. At this moment, it was impossible for him to maintain his autonomy in such a chaotic spacetime. He could only drift in this strange spacetime. It was difficult to keep his body unaffected, let alone comprehend the mysteries within. When he understood this, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel slight pity for the fates of the other golden, immortal realm cultivators. Even though they were able to protect themselves in such a strange space, they would probably experience all sorts of strange things that even exceeded the scope of understanding of living beings. Encountering numerous versions of himself like Luo Fan was probably only one of them that was the easiest to understand. After thinking for a moment, Luo Fan tossed these thoughts aside. He focused his attention on the abnormality of the surrounding space. In Luo Fan's opinion, time and space were just two different types of energy. At this moment, the abnormality of this space was to him. It was the abnormality of the structure of these two types of energy. The original structure of time and space was extremely stable, to the point that it couldn't be broken or broken. At this moment, the abnormality of this structure was both a trouble and an opportunity for him at the same time. An opportunity that allowed him to comprehend these two types of energy more deeply. An opportunity that allowed him to control time and space more perfectly, or in other words, it was an opportunity. Thinking of this, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel a faint excitement in his mind. All distracting thoughts were completely eliminated by him, and he began to analyze the surrounding power of time and space with the help of various mysterious methods inherited from Tao Master Hercules. The abnormality of the structure of time and space was already a fact in front of him. But for Luo Fan, understanding this structure wasn't his goal. His goal was to understand the source of this abnormality. By studying this source, not only would he be able to comprehend the mysteries of time and space, but he would also be able to find the root of the starfields of upheaval. If he could find the root, then he would be able to find the core of the starfields of upheaval. Then he would be able to destroy it and pass the 3,335th trial. With this plan in mind, Luo Fan finally understood why he had encountered so many versions of himself. Finding the root of the chaos in one area wasn't enough. It was like determining the shape of a triangle required 3 points. To determine the shape of a quadrilateral required 4 points. To determine the root of the chaos in the starfields, it was impossible to start from this one area. You would have to search for the root of the chaos. You would have to search for dozens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of areas. Only then would you be able to find the root of the chaos. The dozens of versions of himself he had encountered were the same as the dozens of times he had entered the starfields of upheaval. Shaking his head, Luo Fan had a better idea of what he was about to accomplish, but he didn't feel any negative emotions. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even tens of millions of times to him were nothing. In any case, every time he found the source of chaos in a certain chaotic zone, it was a process of cultivation progress for him. Even if he had to find the root of the chaos in tens of millions of areas, it would only take him a few tens of millions of times. So what if it's nothing? Could it compare to spending trillions of years to solidify his cultivation foundation? Trouble? Difficulty? With a smile, Luo Fan entered into a state of deep enlightenment. Time flew by, and in the blink of an eye, 3 years had passed. He had finally grasped the root of the chaos in the starfields of upheaval. Hidden beneath the layers of space and time, hidden behind the boundless principles and protogenia, was the power that defined the starfields of upheaval. In the eyes of other cultivators, it wasn't much of a power. This chaotic energy was obviously a broken chaotic energy. It was just a strand of the complete chaotic energy. Although this chaos power was able to display the complete characteristics of the chaos power, it was extremely incomplete and one-sided. Even if one were to forcefully deduce it, there would definitely be a huge deviation in the final result. This proved Luo Fan right. He couldn't rely on just one area of upheaval to extrapolate the root of the chaos in the starfields of upheaval. He needed to find more and more of the chaos energy in the starfields of upheaval to weave together the complete version. Only then would he be able to find the root of the chaos. Chapter 863. For such a situation, Luo Fan had already expected it, so naturally, he was not discouraged. First written novel, fastest novel update. With a thought, he snapped out of his state of comprehending the source of the zone of chaos and slowly stood up. With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure instantly streaked through the air in a mysterious trajectory. This trajectory was so complex and profound that it couldn't be described with words. It seemed to contain some sort of chaotic aura, but it was completely in line with the source of the zone of chaos. As he took a step forward, his figure instantly disappeared in an area of chaotic space-time. When he reappeared, he was back in the outside world, back where he and the other Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators had first stepped into the starfields of chaos. With a thought, he sensed the power of time around him. Luo Fan knew that although he'd spent 3 years in the zone of chaos, only a moment had passed in the outside world. From the outside world's point of view, or to be more precise, from where he stood, he'd just charged into the zone of chaos. An instant later, he'd stepped out of the zone of chaos with a look of satisfaction on his face. The entire process was mysterious beyond imagination. I see. When he realized this, Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. He now had a deeper understanding of the starfields of chaos. It was important to know that the chaotic zone he had stayed in for 3 years had almost cycled. In other words, the past was the future, and the future was the past. No matter how long you stayed there, it was all internal. Compared to the outside world, it didn't exist. Of course, this didn't mean the zone of chaos was the best place to cultivate. Because besides Luo Fan, even connate Grand Luo Realm cultivators couldn't maintain their sense of self in the zone of chaos. They couldn't stabilize the spacetime around them, and could only drift along with the changes in the zone of chaos. Even protecting oneself required almost all of one's concentration, let alone cultivating normally. Since it was so mysterious, Luo Fan felt even more at ease. After all, he needed to explore many more zone of chaos. If he had to spend more than 3 years on each one, then he would probably need hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of years to truly find the source of the chaos and truly destroy this trial. After all, they were on the bridge of time, and the flow of time here was 10,000 times slower than the outside world. If he were to spend a few hundred years here, it would be equivalent to wasting millions of years. A few thousand years would be tens of millions of years. If it was calculated in terms of 10,000 years, it would be equivalent to hundreds of millions of years. Even Luo Fan would not be able to bear such a waste. At this time, such a change had completely eliminated Luo Fan's worries. Naturally, it made him feel at ease. This was the starfields of chaos, a place where spacetime chaos was as numerous as the stars in the sky. If one wanted to find the region of spacetime turbulence, one only needed to take a glance to see countless time and space anomalies existing in this seemingly boundless starry sky. Under such circumstances, it was rather easy for Luo Fan to find the other chaotic regions. With a sweep of his mind, he saw hundreds and thousands of them. Luo Fan did not hesitate. He stepped forward and randomly chose a region of spacetime turbulence. In the blink of an eye, he found himself in a completely new space. This place was very similar to the region of spacetime turbulence he had entered before. Even the feeling of stepping into this place was the same. Amidst the endless changes, Luo Fan's body released the power of time and space. They transformed into tentacles that held his body in place. No matter how the spacetime around him changed, it could not affect his body. It could not move his body. As this happened, the world in his eyes changed again. The strange lights and shadows that had been constantly changing were now fixed in place. Luo Fan looked around. He did not find himself in a different time like last time. He knew that this region of spacetime turbulence was different from the one he had entered before. Or rather, it was not connected. In such a situation, it was obvious that the source of the spacetime turbulence here was very likely to be different from the power of chaos that he had previously understood. After understanding this, he did not waste any more time. He began the process that he had done before. He tried to understand the source of the spacetime turbulence through the changes in the spacetime and space. This process lasted for nearly 3 years before Luo Fan completed the entire process of comprehension. He found the source of the chaos in this chaotic zone. It was incomplete, very broken, and there were traces of chaotic energy. After adding the mysteries of the power of chaos to what he had comprehended before, the power of chaos became a little more complete. However, it was still very far from being complete and perfect. Obviously, he still had to continue to look for more places of spacetime turbulence. With a slight thought, Luo Fan stepped out from the source of the spacetime turbulence. He easily transcended the place of spacetime turbulence and arrived in the starry sky outside. Similarly, the time in the outside world was still the instant after he had stepped into the space-time turbulence. The time in the space-time turbulence did not affect the outside world at all. Luo Fan had expected this, but he did not have any distracting thoughts. With a thought, he entered another region of space-time turbulence. After a moment, he emerged from that region. At this time, apart from the slight understanding in his eyes, he looked no different from before. Just like this, Luo Fan continuously entered one region of space-time turbulence after another. In just half a day, he had already repeated this process more than 300,000 times. This half a day was only half a day in the outside world. However, to Luo Fan, the time he had experienced was more than 1,000,000 years. The regions of space-time turbulence seemed to be scattered, but if the source of chaos in two different regions was the same, then no matter which region one stepped into, they would arrive at the same place. Among the 300,000 regions that Luo Fan had entered in half a day, close to 10% of them had the same source of chaos as the other regions. In other words, there were close to 30,000 times when he stepped into a region that he had entered before and saw another version of himself at a different time. Among them, there were dozens of times when he had stepped into the same region of space-time he had entered for the first time. Apart from these regions of space-time that he had entered before, in the other 300,000 regions of space-time turbulence, Luo Fan spent an average of 3 years to completely understand the source of chaos and find the power of chaos that had caused the space-time turbulence in these regions. Among them, some regions took a shorter time, only a few months, while others took 7 or 8 years. The pattern depended on how much of the source of chaos there was, but it wasn't determined by how quickly Luo Fan comprehended it. After spending such a long time, using so many different methods, and finally comprehending the 300,000 strands of chaos power, Luo Fan finally managed to reconstruct the power that had caused the entire starfields of chaos to descend into chaos. Although there were still traces of flaws and cracks within it, it was still possible to see through it. It wasn't complete, but overall, there was no longer any doubt in Luo Fan's mind. What Luo Fan needed to do next was no longer to continue exploring the regions of spacetime. Instead, he needed to start from the reconstructed power of chaos and gain a deeper understanding of it. The last strand of chaos he had comprehended had already formed the framework of the power of chaos. The flaws and cracks were insignificant compared to the entirety of the power of chaos. Starting from what he had learned before, he could make up for it. Naturally, he didn't need to continue studying the other regions of chaos. Even if he wanted to, it would be difficult. There were many chaotic zones in the starfields of chaos, but Luo Fan had a rough idea of their type. He had even spotted Xiantian Grand Luo realm cultivators, including martial emperors. He was just looking for other chaotic zones. It would be difficult to find a region he hadn't entered before. Under these circumstances, rather than pinning his hopes on finding a new region of chaos, it was better to focus on perfecting the framework of chaos. With this realization in mind, Luo Fan looked around, examining the endless regions of chaos that littered the starfields of chaos. Before long, he found a region that wasn't as chaotic. He didn't need to expend too much energy to fix himself in place. With a thought, he lifted his foot and stepped into it. After he stepped into it, he'd already fixed the space and time around him with a thought, and then he raised his eyes to look over. He saw himself sitting cross-legged in space nearby, and his eyes seemed to be closed. Obviously, he was comprehending the profundities of this area. This was the version of him who had entered the 10,000th region of chaos to understand the source of chaos. Looking at himself from this point of view, Luo Fan suddenly felt an indescribable emotion wash over him. At this moment, in this region of chaos, the past, the present, and the future coexisted. For him, he who was comprehending the chaotic zone not far away was the past. For the past him, the present him was the future. For the two of them, they were the present. The three of them coexisted in this world, and the cycle of reincarnation, the flow of time, and its mysteries were vividly and vividly displayed. In an instant, the memories of the past, the present, and the future resurfaced, without missing a single detail. All of these feelings intertwined with the one he was feeling now. In an instant, the past, the present, and the future merged into one. In a trance, he suddenly felt that the chaotic power, which was originally flawed and incomplete, suddenly became complete at an unimaginable speed. The imperfect power quickly disappeared, and the cracks were mended. Before long, it had completed the process that Luo Fan had expected to take hundreds of thousands of years to complete. The perfect power of chaos appeared in Luo Fan's mind. Luo Fan was finally able to understand the source of chaos in the starfield of chaos. When the power of chaos became complete, the region of chaos before him was no longer a mystery to him. In fact, he could even sense the starry sky outside the chaotic zone. The circulation of the various laws, the mysteries of the great Tao hidden behind them, and the chaotic power that caused time to reverse and space to become chaotic in the starry domain were all revealed to him without any concealment. So that's how it is. Luo Fan's face lit up with understanding. With a thought, he took a step forward and his figure was already out of the chaotic zone. This speed was many times faster than the speed he had experienced in the region of chaos. It was almost as if he had accidentally entered the region of chaos before. It was no wonder that he hadn't noticed anything strange about his other self in the region of chaos. When he arrived in the outside world, Luo Fan didn't hesitate. His way of walking was extremely mysterious and complicated. He didn't move in a straight line, nor did he go around the regions of chaos. Instead, it was as if he was specifically looking for the regions of chaos to enter. But when he entered the regions of chaos, he was no longer in his original location. He was now in a different region of chaos. He had traversed a vast expanse of space. He moved forward in such a reckless manner. In less than half a day, Luo Fan had already traversed the void that was dozens of light years away and arrived at a strange location. This place didn't look any different from any other place. It was also filled with countless chaotic regions. Moreover, the density of the chaotic regions was not any different from other places. However, Luo Fan knew that in this place, this was the source of the chaotic energy. The source of the chaotic starfields was in this region, hidden within one of the regions of chaos. After absorbing the past, present, and future, the three mysteries of chaos, into one body, Luo Fan's perception of the chaotic energy had reached a point where it couldn't be hidden. All he could see was the power of the starfields of chaotic strife. It was like a boundless ocean, blotting out the sky and covering the earth. Within this ocean of chaotic energy, there was a giant vortex. It was connected to one of the regions of chaos. If Luo Fan didn't know where the core of the chaotic energy was, then wouldn't he have wasted his time in the perishment stage? He smiled faintly. Luo Fan took a step forward and stepped into the chaotic region that overlapped with the ocean whirlpool of chaotic force. As soon as he stepped into it, the surrounding light and shadows changed. In an instant, it seemed as if countless living beings flashed before him, and there were even countless images of him. It was as if he'd been here countless times, or as if he'd been here for countless years. Among the images, it wasn't just him, but the 20 or so connate Grand Luo cultivators, including Emperor Wu. He could even see how the connate Grand Luo cultivators struggled, and how the changes in space and time had an indescribable effect on them. With a thought, Luo Fan transformed the power within him into the power of time and space. It transformed into a giant tentacle that locked down the space and time around him, barely keeping him in place. But this time, the power of time and space he had to expend was 1,000 times more than what he'd expended in other regions of chaos. Moreover, even after he'd stabilized his body, the area he could affect was only a few dozen feet around him. Beyond that area, time and space were still constantly changing, and there were still countless flashes of light and shadows. Everything was the same as before. If there was a difference, it was that the speed of the changes was much faster. It was as if the entire starfield of chaotic strife's chaotic energy was crushing down on him. It was as if all of the chaotic energy in the starfield of chaotic strife was crushing down on him. It was trying to assimilate him into the chaotic energy. Luo Fan hovered there, his expression indifferent. He hadn't expected this to happen, but he'd expected most of it. Naturally, he wasn't fazed. The chaotic force was a mysterious force. It contained a kind of mixed supreme divine might that even surpassed time and space. Even if it was just a trace of this power, its might would be boundless. It would be enough to cause living beings to be at a loss for what to do, and even cause them to perish. What's more, the chaotic energy that blotted out the sky and covered the earth was like an ocean. Although Luo Fan was already a destroyer, and had completely comprehended the mysteries of the chaotic force, even if he converted all of his power into the chaotic force, compared to the ocean of chaotic force, it was still like a drop in the ocean. It was simply insignificant. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan did not use the chaos force to change this chaotic region. Instead, he used the power of time and space, which could be used by the chaos force, to stabilize his existence. After all, the chaotic power was the source of the chaotic zone. It required divine might that could change the entire sea of chaotic power. As for the time force and space force, they only needed to be constantly replenished to resist the chaotic power's influence on them, and they would be able to maintain their existence. Luo Fan carefully examined the countless changes in the light around him. He carefully sensed the changes in the chaotic energy around him. With a single thought, he took a step in a certain direction. Every step he took required him to withstand the repulsive force of the chaotic energy. Every step required a great deal of energy. However, with every step he took, he would be a step closer to the source of the chaotic energy. The reason for that was because the direction he was heading in was the direction where the changes in the light were the most intense. The more intense the changes in the light, the stronger the effect of the chaotic power was. Naturally, he would be closer to the source of the chaotic power. To be continued. Chapter 864. Just as Luo Fan was approaching the core, thousands of lights and shadows suddenly fused together amidst the ever-changing lights and shadows around Luo Fan. After that, a connate golden immortal realm cultivator materialized, and he actually broke away from the boundless light in the blink of an eye. He arrived by Luo Fan's side and stepped into the space and time that Luo Fan had fixed. This connate true Luo was one of the rare females amongst the 20-odd connate true Luo cultivators. She was the spacewalker, the Empyrean. Luo Fan's heart moved, and he stopped moving forward. The space and time he'd fixed around him was his domain. If he didn't want to, he could repel the Empyrean the moment she stepped through the air, and return her to the ever-changing light and shadows. But he didn't think of doing that. The Empyrean's presence wouldn't affect him in the slightest. It wouldn't cost him too much energy. Moreover, he was astonished that the Empyrean could emerge from the light and shadows. This was the source of all the chaos in the starfields. What they saw was a projection of the starfields of upheaval, and what they saw was an image of the starfields of upheaval. Perhaps it had a mysterious connection to the real regions of strife, but it wasn't the regions of strife. Even Luo Fan, who'd fully comprehended the power of the starfields of strife, couldn't materialize himself from the light and shadows and traverse space and time to appear here. However, the air hostess in front of him seemed to be able to do it rather easily. How could Luo Fan not be interested? Thank you, Taoist Luo. The Empyrean was cold and distant, but it was Luo Fan who'd protected her. She couldn't remain silent. She bowed respectfully to Luo Fan. Taoist Luo Fan's powers are amazing. How did you manage to get here? Luo Fan smiled. Nothing much. It's nothing much. Because of my special ability, the world I see is completely different from ordinary living beings. Time and space are not in the normal order. Instead, it was presented in a completely unfolded manner. The starfields of chaotic strife are strange, but I am able to restrain them. That is why I am able to locate you. Only then was I able to find the path that led to you, fellow Taoist. Fortunately, fellow Taoist didn't abandon me. Otherwise, I'm afraid I wouldn't have been able to escape. The Sky Maiden didn't dare to be negligent and explained in detail. I see. Luo Fan suddenly understood. Time and space within the starfields of chaotic strife was a strange and unimaginable place. But no matter what, it was still limited to time and space. Under such circumstances, it was not much different from ordinary space to the Void Lady, who could sense time and space in a different manner. The reason why she couldn't find the core of the starfields, and had to wait for him to arrive, was because her cultivation was far too low. She could sense the core of the starfields, but she couldn't do so because she couldn't see the core of the starfields. She couldn't find the crux of the starfields of chaotic strife, and couldn't escape the influence of time and space. She couldn't come here on her own. Is fellow Taoist Empty Girl's special ability innate? Luo Fan's mind stirred. He asked. He knew about the Sky Maiden's special ability, but he didn't think much of it. He was confident that no matter what it was, it couldn't compare to the power he gained after becoming an exterminator. However, at this moment, after personally experiencing the wonders of Air Hostess's ability, he could not help but be interested, and he had the thought of learning this ability. This ability is indeed something that I was born with. The Space Maiden smiled and said. The Sky Maiden was inexplicably beautiful, but her face was calm, almost cold. She had an unapproachable aura, causing people to involuntarily neglect her beauty. At this moment she suddenly smiled sweetly. Her beauty was no longer concealed, and for a moment, the surrounding space and time became a lot brighter. Of course, Luo Fan didn't notice this at all. It couldn't cause any ripples in his mind at all. Born with it. Luo Fan's eyes lit up. An innate ability was something that a living being had when it was born. It could either come from its physical body or from its spirit. But no matter where it came from, it would have an innate ability that was different from other living beings. This meant that the power that formed this living being was different from other living beings. It could be that they had brand new powers that other living beings didn't have, or that their powers were constructed in a different way from other living beings. To Luo Fan, who cultivated the Tao of power inherited from the great strength Tao Lord, all of these were extremely useful and beneficial to his cultivation. In comparison, if the ability wasn't born with it, but obtained through some kind of cultivation method, it wouldn't be as valuable to Luo Fan. That was because there was a limit to cultivation method. Only cultivators whose Daos were compatible with the cultivation method could cultivate the same cultivation method to the peak. If the Sky Maiden had obtained this ability through some kind of cultivation method, then it was obvious that only the Sky Maiden herself could cultivate that cultivation method to its peak. Even Luo Fan, who had entered the Perish Realm, would probably have to modify that cultivation method countless times to make it suitable for him to cultivate. In the end, he would only gain another ability, and it wouldn't be of much use to his own cultivation. With such considerations, Luo Fan immediately smiled and said, I'm rather interested in your ability. I wonder if you can allow me to examine it? The Sky Maiden's expression changed slightly when she heard what Luo Fan said. It was true that the Sky Maiden was an innate golden immortal, and it was also true that she had experienced a few billion years since she started cultivating until now. However, she was a woman no matter what. Even if she was an innate golden immortal and had experienced a few billion years, it was impossible to completely change the remnants of her mentality as a woman. Yet at this very moment, Luo Fan actually told her that he was interested in her ability and wanted to examine her body. It was easy to imagine how shocking it was to her. The The Sky Maiden's first reaction was to refuse Luo Fan's abrupt request. However, she quickly came to her senses and could not help but feel some hope. Her ability to view time and space as flat was something she had possessed since she was born. Over the past few billion years, she had used countless methods to develop this ability. She had constantly improved the ability's power, but she had already reached her limit at this point. If she wanted to improve further, she would have to suddenly obtain great inspiration. Or, she would have to obtain a shocking increase in her cultivation. Clearly, these two methods were like flowers in the mirror or the moon in the water for her at this moment. It was impossible for her to rely on them. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan, who was countless times more powerful than her and even more powerful than all the cultivators she had met, had suddenly mentioned that he was interested in her ability. Wanting to study it was simply an enormous fortuitous encounter for the Sky Maiden, and it was a superb opportunity for her to break through the bottleneck of her ability. With that thought, even though she still felt a little awkward and even a little shy, she still nodded slowly and said, "Fellow Luo Fan, if you want to study my ability, you should be able to do so." Naturally, there was no problem. However, my ability has been stagnant for hundreds of millions of years. If fellow Taoist gains anything from your research, I hope you won't be stingy with your guidance. Luo Fan did not pay much attention to the change in the air hostess's mentality. He had been cultivating for trillions of years, and the difference between men and women in the mortal world was as far away as thousands of years ago to him. Even though the Empyrean before him was a woman, he didn't differentiate her consciousness, and he merely took her to be an ordinary golden immortal realm cultivator. It was also because of this mentality that he was so straightforward when he said that he wanted to check her body. But if he had the slightest idea that men and women were different, he would never have said such a thing. However, he could not be blamed for this. For Luo Fan, who had created millions of worlds and billions of times more living beings, the body of a woman was no secret to him at all. The female body was no secret to him. He could even casually create it, so why would he care too much about it? He was rather delighted when he heard the Empyrean agree, and he said with a smile, "Of course. Since I've studied your body, I naturally have to tell you." The Empyrean was relieved when she heard that. She slowly dispersed the golden immortal realm power that coiled around her, and she revealed herself to Luo Fan without holding back. Facing such an Empyrean, Luo Fan naturally would not be courteous at all. With a thought, his perception instantly enveloped the entire body of the Empyrean. Perception was a more meticulous method of observation than the eyes. Perception could sense what the eyes could see, and most of what the eyes could not see could be sensed by perception. At this moment, as the Empyrean presented her body to Luo Fan without any defense, Luo Fan used his perception to sense the Empyrean's body. The Empyrean's clothes did not have any concealment effect at all. In Luo Fan's perception, the Empyrean was completely naked. Her body was naturally countless times more beautiful than an ordinary woman's. However, no matter how beautiful it was, she was still a woman, and it could not arouse any of his emotions. To Luo Fan, it was just an ordinary body. However, when his perception that seemed material swept past, the Empyrean only felt as if her entire body was being caressed by a large hand, and she could not help but tremble. Fortunately, she was also an golden immortal realm cultivator, and her control over her body was extremely strong and perfect. As a result, even though her emotions were shaken, it did not leak out at all. Luo Fan did not sense any changes in her at all. However, in her eyes, there was a rare shyness that had not appeared for countless years. There was no trace of the indifference that she had before, which was close to indifference. Luo Fan naturally did not care about what the Empyrean was feeling. At this moment, he was completely focused on the Empyrean. After his perception swept past her body, it seeped into her acupoints and instantly grasped everything inside and outside of her body. The Empyrean also cultivated the path of a golden core. However, she focused on spacetime in her path of golden core. The golden immortal realm in her body contained all sorts of mysteries of spacetime. It seemed illusory yet real, and it even seemed to be able to jump through the river of time and travel to the past and the future. As soon as he saw this power, Luo Fan knew that it was definitely the path of cultivation that the Empyrean had comprehended based on her innate abilities and the path of a golden core. Although it was not as powerful as the martial arts of a martial emperor, it unintentionally possessed some characteristics of a Tao of self. The reason why it was unintentionally was because the Empyrean herself did not realize that she wanted to open up her Tao of self at all. Instead, she treated the path of a golden core as the only path of cultivation that she could take for granted. The characteristics of a Tao of self did not come from her heart. Instead, it came from her innate abilities and divine abilities. Although Luo Fan felt that it was a pity, he did not intend to expose her. Although the Empyrean had agreed to let him examine her body, he had understood her innate abilities. However, he had also promised to pass on what he had learned to her once he understood the key point. Seriously speaking, it was just a transaction. Their relationship had not reached the level of his relationship with a martial emperor, so it was naturally impossible for him to reveal the key points of a Tao to her. After carefully comprehending the Empyrean's body, and even delving into the depths of her body, Luo Fan discovered that this innate ability did not come from her body. It came from her spirit, from the source of her life. With a thought, he did not hesitate. His perception flowed through her body and into the mud pill palace between her eyebrows. Then, following the mud pill palace, he entered the world of her knowledge. In the world of the Empyrean's knowledge, there was a world that was beyond Luo Fan's imagination. The structure of this world was extremely strange. It was not like any world that could exist in the real world. It was not like any world that could exist in Luo Fan's knowledge. It was like any world that could exist in the real world. This world of the Empyrean's knowledge contained endless space and time. This endless space and time existed in a very strange way. It was a way that Luo Fan had never seen before. It was even stranger than the existence of the chaotic starfields. It was even more unbelievable. In this world of the Empyrean's knowledge, the endless space and time were distorted by the rules of the origin. It was laid out in a flat plane. The past, the present, and the future were all laid bare in front of him. Even a commoner without any special abilities could easily see all of this. He knew that this was how the past, the present, and the future all existed at the same time. As for the space, it was even more boundless. All of the space was directly presented in front of him. In this way, to Luo Fan, it was strange and strange. But to a commoner, it was like the endless space and time were stacked on top of each other. It was impossible to separate them. In this situation, the past, the present, and the future were intertwined. It was easy to imagine how strange and unbelievable the world was. This must be the world that the Empyrean saw. It is indeed very mysterious. It's very different from the perspective of the perishment realm. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. He was glad that he had made the right decision. This kind of perspective was a great supplement to the perspective of the realm of perishment. Evidently, even if the power he found wasn't of much help to his path of strength, just the insight he gained from this perspective was worth the price of the ticket. Although this space and time was unimaginably strange, as long as it was presented to him, Luo Fan could quickly grasp the source of its mysteries and easily distinguish the real from the fake. Soon, he found the location of the Empyrean's spirit hidden in the endless space and time. With a single step, he traversed the endless space and time in an instant. He arrived at the center of the Empyrean's knowledge. He stood in the middle of the seemingly real and illusory ball of light that seemed to contain the entire river of time and space. It was a ball of light that exuded endless vitality and contained endless mysteries. This was the Empyrean's spirit. Within it was the Empyrean's life essence. Not all spirits existed in the form of born ways bodies. The Empyrean's spirit clearly did not have the appearance of a born ways body. Instead, it was like the origin of time. The spirit was just flowing naturally at the moment. There was not a single thought, as if the Empyrean's consciousness did not exist within it. It was just a simple origin of time. Luo Fan's direct goal for coming here was to find the source of that power in the origin of life. He was only one step away, so he naturally did not hesitate. With a thought, his perception directly cut into this ball of divine soul. The moment his senses entered, the strands of the Empyrean's memories attacked him. Although Luo Fan did not treat the Empyrean as a woman different from other connate zenith heaven cultivators, he was not completely unconcerned. With a thought, layers of barriers formed around his senses, blocking the Empyrean's memories. The memories could only crash against the barriers, but they could not invade his senses, much less be sensed by him. The Empyrean had actually been observing Luo Fan's actions. When she saw this, she could not help but sigh in relief. Chapter 865. Luo Fan was a destroyer. What he sensed was much deeper than what the Air Maiden, who was an innate golden immortal, could sense. Words first appeared. The Air Maiden's soul was in this place, but when Luo Fan's senses swept past it, he was able to easily surpass the Air Maiden with his understanding of the soul. In just a short while, he had already pushed his understanding to a level that the Air Maiden could not compare to. This situation might seem absurd, but it was not. The Air Maiden's epiphany towards her own soul was like a blind man touching an elephant. She might be able to sense it clearly, but it was limited by her realm and the limits of her senses. Even if she spent a long period of time, what she obtained might not be the true appearance of the soul. But it was different for Luo Fan. Luo Fan was a destroyer, and the limits of his senses were much greater than the Air Maiden's. What he sensed was like a person with eyes. He could see the entire appearance of the elephant, and what he obtained was naturally much clearer than the Air Maiden, who had spent countless years studying it. I see. As expected, it's a power I've never seen before. At the instant his understanding towards the origin of life surpassed the Air Maiden's, Luo Fan grasped the source of the Air Maiden's innate ability, and he learned what caused the world she sensed to possess such profound mysteries. With a single thought, his senses locked down on the traces of that power, and he isolated himself from everything else, including the other senses he had toward the Air Maiden's soul. It was at this moment that the air hostess suddenly felt a strange warmth in the depths of her divine soul. It was as if she was suddenly enveloped by a great existence that could not be described with words. A warm, safe, and comfortable feeling enveloped her, and she could not help but have a baffled expression appear on her face. I didn't expect that fellow Taoist Luo Fan would have already found the crux so quickly. A thought suddenly flashed through the Space Maiden's mind, and there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. The various sensations just now had allowed her to understand that an incredibly important existence in her soul had been enveloped by a vast sense, and it had already become the target of Luo Fan's inspection of her body. There was no need to guess. That was definitely the key to his ability. Otherwise, Luo Fan would definitely not focus all of his perception on that spot. At this time, Luo Fan was wholeheartedly paying attention to the trace of power that he had grasped, carefully sensing the mystery of this power. This was a force. It was a power that Luo Fan had never seen before, but it was faintly similar to time power and spatial power to a certain extent. This power was indescribably exquisite. It contained infinite principles and extremely profound mysteries of space and time. As his understanding of this power deepened, a faint understanding gradually emerged in Luo Fan's mind. This understanding even affected the power in his body. It caused the power in his body to undergo an extremely subtle and profound change. That change couldn't be described with words. It seemed as if it existed, as if it didn't exist, as if it was an illusion, and as if it was reality. It was extremely mysterious and unpredictable. This process continued, and in the blink of an eye, 1,000 years had passed. That power was a completely new kind of power. Luo Fan had never seen this power before, and this power had completely merged with the Air Maiden's body. It was a combination of all the mysterious powers she had cultivated over the past billions of years. The mysterious powers were mixed together, and they were inseparable. It was difficult to separate them. Therefore, for Luo Fan to comprehend this vast power was extremely difficult. At least, it was hundreds of times more difficult than when he had tried to comprehend the powers of other living beings. It was also because of this that he had spent 1,000 years to barely complete this comprehension process. Fortunately, the place he and the Air Maiden were in was the most chaotic place in the starfields of chaos. Time here was isolated from the outside world, and did not interfere with each other. Although it had been 1,000 years, to the outside world it was only a moment. It did not take up the time he had wasted in the starfields of chaos. 1,000 years. For Luo Fan, it was a process of wholeheartedly paying attention to the mysteries of the power that existed within the Air Maiden's life essence. But for the Air Maiden, that was not the case at all. For the Air Maiden, during these 1,000 years, she was completely immersed in warmth, safety, and comfort. Luo Fan's exploration of the power, his study of it, was like a pair of hands caressing her soul, an embrace embracing her. That wonderful feeling had long ago intoxicated her, and she found it difficult to extricate herself. Even a connate Daluo cultivator with a strong will could not remain unmoved by this feeling, which had lingered in the depths of her heart for 1,000 years. On this day, Luo Fan laughed heartily. He withdrew his senses and left the Air Maiden's body. At the same time, the power in his body circulated slightly and turned into a mysterious power. It was different from time and space, but it contained the nature of time and space power. It flowed endlessly within his body. Under the influence of this power, Luo Fan's vision of the world began to change. Another mysterious existence was added to the scene that the destroyer saw. The past, the present, and the future were laid out in front of him, and the infinite space was overlaid in front of him. However, they were separated in an extremely mysterious way, so that he would not be confused at all. What he saw wasn't just limited to the area of space-time disruption. It encompassed the entire starfields of chaos, spanning hundreds of thousands of light-years. Hundreds of thousands of light-years wasn't the limit of this power. Or rather, it wasn't Luo Fan's limit. The reason it was only a few 100,000 light-years was because the starfields of upheaval only spanned a few 100,000 light-years. The situation at this moment was clearly when Luo Fan changed the power in his body into the power that fused with Space Maiden's life origin. Naturally, he obtained Space Maiden's mysterious ability and a special perspective that allowed him to interpret time and space in another way. Space-time, in Luo Fan's eyes, was just power. From this perspective, one could interpret time and space in a different way, which was equivalent to viewing the power of time and space from a different perspective and distorting the manifestations of these two powers in a different way. Clearly, this was a great supplement to the perspective of those in the perishment realm. As he carefully savored the perspective of this power, an inexplicable feeling welled up in his heart. It was something he'd gained after breaking through to the 8th stage of celestial realm. The majestic power that encompassed the entire Earth's cosmos was now much clearer. He even felt like he was beginning to grasp some of that power's wondrous nature. To think there would be such a place. What a pleasant surprise! Luo Fan was overjoyed when he sensed the nature of that power. The Herculean Tao sovereign's worldview. They viewed everything as being made up of power. Even the state of chaos was no exception. It was all power. He could faintly sense the vast power that encompassed the entire Earth's cosmos. That was the state of chaos. At the moment, he could sense the nature of that power, which meant that he could sense the nature of the state of chaos. It was a monumental improvement. It was as if a tightly shut door had been pushed open a tiny gap. This was compared to the situation where the door was completely shut. Compared to the situation where he could not find a place to attack, it was thousands of times better. The nature of the state of chaos was nothing else. It resonated with the power that Luo Fan had obtained and fused with Space Maiden's life source. That power was not time energy, nor was it spatial energy. However, it possessed the various characteristics of both. In a certain aspect, it could be seen as a power that was similar to spacetime power. In the state of chaos, time power, the power of space and countless other powers were mixed together in an extremely strange way, and could not be separated. The mixing and inseparability of the two clearly had a certain degree of compatibility. It was this compatibility that caused the two to resonate. This allowed Luo Fan, who had circulated that power around his body, to interpret the state of chaos from a certain perspective. That was why the current situation had occurred. As he carefully sensed the tip of the iceberg of the power that was revealed from a boundless high place, Luo Fan's consciousness suddenly rose infinitely. All sorts of inexplicable feelings were born in his heart. The world in his eyes was constantly changing as he comprehended it. In the perspective brought by the state of perishing, the boundless rules kept fading in the change. Or rather, it could be said that they kept getting rid of the appearance of the changes as they delved deep into the source of the rules. Due to this change, the world in Luo Fan's eyes was rapidly approaching nothingness. After an unknown period of time, only then did Luo Fan return to his senses from the comprehension. His aura trembled, and a sliver of his aura could not be suppressed. It directly created an intense space-time storm in the chaotic region, causing the changing light and shadows around him to change even more violently. Although the sliver of aura was extremely small, its essence was supreme. Just a sliver of it was enough to make Space Maidens will feel an almost unbearable impact. If it were not for the fact that her life source had been enveloped by Luo Fan's senses for 1,000 years, which allowed her to adapt to Luo Fan's aura even more strongly, just a sliver of his aura might have been enough to plant an indelible shadow in her mind and cause irreparable damage to her future cultivation. Taoist Luo Fan has actually become stronger again? At this moment, Space Maiden, who was feeling complicated, suddenly reacted. Her heart was filled with indescribable shock. The scene of Luo Fan breaking through the 8th stage of the immortal realm to the 9th stage of the immortal realm was still vivid in her mind. The vast and earth-shattering aura that was revealed at that time was still lingering in her memory. Space Maiden couldn't be clearer about the aura at that time. At this moment, although the sliver of aura that Luo Fan had revealed was extremely small, its essence was much stronger than the aura that she had sensed before. Given this situation, how could she not know that Luo Fan had made new progress and made a new breakthrough? After understanding that Luo Fan had made a breakthrough, Space Maiden could not help but look at Luo Fan with a complicated gaze. Previously, her life source had been enveloped by Space Maiden's senses for 1,000 years. The impact on Space Maiden had far exceeded Luo Fan's imagination. Even if a connate Zenith Heaven cultivator was hugged by a man for 1,000 years, she would definitely feel something for this man. Moreover, using her senses to envelop her life source was a more intimate method than hugging or even dual cultivation. With such 1,000 years of time, how could Space Maiden still treat Luo Fan as an ordinary fellow cultivator? She had already developed various thoughts about him that did not belong to the same cultivator. When she looked at Luo Fan, she felt that he was especially different from others, and some extremely subtle feelings arose in her. That kind of feeling naturally could not be love. For cultivators who had obtained immortality, something like love was definitely not something that could be easily produced. Even if she had already enjoyed such a comfortable feeling that was stronger than hugging, Space Maiden would definitely not fall in love with Luo Fan just because of this. Even if it was not love, such feelings were definitely not ordinary. At this moment, this feeling was suppressed by Luo Fan's aura, but it became deeper. It became even hotter, and it was even faintly transforming into another kind of emotion. At the same time, an inexplicable hope was also born in her heart. Over the years, what Luo Fan had been doing was none other than studying her body, studying her innate ability. He had studied her innate ability. At this moment, he had made such a breakthrough, and it was obvious that he had obtained it from this research. This meant that he must have made great progress in the research of that ability. As Space Maiden's heart was in turmoil, her expression became slightly dazed. At this moment, Luo Fan naturally did not care about Space Maiden's expression. At this moment, he was wholeheartedly paying attention to the changes within his body. The various comprehensions that he had gained previously were unimaginably beneficial to him. At this moment, he could even faintly see the existence of the void comprehending state. Although it was still rather far away, he already had a certain direction. With a feasible path to reach that state, he would no longer have to fumble in the dark like before. Other than the improvement in the state, the power in his body that was like the source of power had been refined countless times. That power had become even purer and purer, and the characteristics of the countless powers within it had fused even more perfectly. Even his cultivation level, that had just reached the 9th rank of the celestial realm, had completely stabilized during this process. There was not a trace of faintness anymore, and it was as if he had been immersed in the 9th rank of the celestial realm for countless years. After carefully sensing the various changes in his body for a long time, Luo Fan let out a long breath. A faint smile appeared on his face. When he opened his eyes, he noticed that Space Maiden seemed to be in a daze. It seemed like her emotions were extremely chaotic, and she could not control herself. When a connate golden immortal realm cultivator suddenly revealed such an expression, it caused Luo Fan to frown, yet he didn't say anything. He just watched silently. Fortunately, even though Space Maiden's emotions were chaotic, she did not completely lose her senses to the outside world. After a few breaths of time, when Luo Fan looked at her, she had already returned to her senses. She blinked and noticed the situation before her, and she could not help but reveal slight embarrassment in her eyes. However, her expression had returned to its calm and tranquil state. It was a display of his extraordinary control over his own body. "Fellow Taoist, you seem to have gained a great deal. May I know what you have to teach me?" She barely managed to calm herself down and spoke indifferently. Even though Luo Fan knew that Space Maiden's mind was definitely restless at this moment and had many distracting thoughts, he did not think about it at all. When he heard Space Maiden's words, he just smiled and said, "You have gained quite a bit. Fellow Taoist's ability comes from a special power. This power contains the characteristics of time and space, and it possesses various profound abilities. If you are willing, I can create a technique for you to sense that power." Even though Space Maiden's emotions were chaotic, she was still overjoyed when she heard that. She could no longer maintain her previous indifference and said eagerly, "Fellow Taoist, please teach me." Luo Fan had already completely comprehended the characteristics of that power in the past 1,000 years. He wanted to create a method that Sky Maiden could cultivate, sense that power, circulate that power, and increase that power. However, it was only a matter of a thought. It did not require much time at all. Because of this, Luo Fan could casually say that he wanted to create a technique to give to the Space Maiden. Luo Fan did not hesitate when he saw that the empty lady was in such a hurry. A thought passed through his mind and a countless number of complicated and mysterious characters and symbols rotated within his mind. He had a relatively complete grasp of the Sky Maiden's cultivation path from the previous round of sensing. At this moment, it was naturally not difficult for him to create a cultivation method that the Sky Maiden could cultivate. With a slight thought, the cultivation method appeared in his mind in an endless stream. Before long, it had become an extremely complete technique that was completely compatible with Space Maiden's original path of cultivation. After the technique was completely formed, Luo Fan could not be bothered to give it a name. He raised his hand and pointed. The technique turned into a ray of light that flew out of his finger and floated towards Space Maiden. The ray of light was extremely profound, as if it was solid. There seemed to be endless profound words flowing endlessly within it. According to Luo Fan, Space Maiden should have collected the ray of light and used some sort of technique to analyze it and extract the information it contained. However, she did not expect that the Space Maiden would raise her finger without hesitation when she saw the spiritual light. The spiritual light rushed into the Mud Pill Palace between her eyebrows and rushed into her sea of consciousness through the Mud Pill Palace. It directly integrated into her divine soul and almost completely integrated into the depths of her memory. She did it so straightforwardly. She did not seem to be wary of Luo Fan at all as she imprinted the ray of light into the depths of her memory. If Luo Fan had done anything to the ray of light, Space Maiden would have suffered a great loss. If she did not have extreme trust in Luo Fan, she would not have made such a choice. Her extreme trust made Luo Fan a little confused for a while. To be continued. Chapter 866. The air hostess's actions were clearly subconscious. It was the side effect of having endured Luo Fan's senses for 1,000 years when he sensed her life source without holding anything back. Text first published, Baidu search. Reading novels fastest updated. Due to the inexplicable feelings she had for Luo Fan, the air hostess instinctively wanted to get close to Luo Fan. Her first reaction was to trust Luo Fan. She did not think that Luo Fan would harm her. In this state of mind, she had no time to react to the spiritual light emitted by Luo Fan. She directly followed her instincts, and without considering anything else, she directly guided it into the world of her sea of consciousness, directly integrating it into her soul, and then into her memory. Luo Fan looked at the air hostess. Although he was curious as to why she would do that, he could not say anything. He just waited quietly. The air hostess absorbed the spiritual light into her spirit and fused the information it contained into her memories. Then, she suddenly felt an extremely mysterious method appear in the depths of her memories out of nowhere. All of her attention had been focused on the cultivation method. She did not have the time to think about the mistakes she had made before. Although the cultivation method had been casually created by Luo Fan was in the annihilation realm, and he had a thorough understanding of the power in the air hostess life source. The cultivation method was so exquisite that the air hostess was amazed. In her eyes, this cultivation method was perfect to the extreme. There were no flaws at all. Every word, every rune, every structure of the words, and every picture had reached an unchangeable perfection. The air hostess could only sigh and admire the cultivation method as she looked at it. The air hostess suddenly blushed slightly as she savored the cultivation method. She realized that the cultivation method was perfectly compatible with the one she had cultivated for billions of years. It was obvious that the person who had created the cultivation method was extremely familiar with her. He must have grasped every single detail of her body to be able to do it. Thinking of this, she naturally recalled the feeling of being completely naked in front of Luo Fan 1,000 years ago. Combined with the indescribable feelings she had for Luo Fan, she could not help but feel shy. After all, she was a Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivator. All kinds of distracting thoughts were suppressed by her, and her complexion returned to normal. With a slight thought, she began to circulate the cultivation method. The cultivation method that Luo Fan had created was not a fundamental cultivation method, but a method that tempered one's perception. After Space Maiden activated the technique, she felt that the power in her body was being depleted at an unimaginable speed, and her senses were undergoing various indescribable changes during the process. It seemed to have increased by countless times. There didn't seem to be any change in strength. Space Maiden had expected this when she was studying the technique. As she activated the technique, she began to circulate the golden core technique that she had cultivated for billions of years. The power in her body kept being produced out of nowhere, replenishing her rapidly depleted power and barely maintaining the balance in her body. Time passed. In the blink of an eye, another 100 years had passed. In the past 100 years, Space Maiden hovered in front of Luo Fan with her legs crossed. She circulated the power in her body and continuously tempered her senses. She changed her senses bit by bit. Luo Fan did not continue to advance. Instead, he hovered in front of Space Maiden and closed his eyes, carefully comprehending the power that was so vast that it could envelop an unknown number of light years in the entire Earth's universe. With his current cultivation realm, it was naturally impossible for him to directly sense that power. However, he possessed the same power that he had obtained from Empty Maiden's body. He relied on the resonance between that power and the power that enveloped the world to sense that power. That was why he was able to enter the annihilation realm. He began to comprehend the chaotic state, even though it was only an insignificant sliver of it. 100 years of time was like a cup of water on a burning cart of firewood. It had only deepened his understanding back then. If he wanted to take a step further, he would have to take a step further. If he wanted to take a step deeper, he would not have enough time. On this day, when Luo Fan was comprehending the profound mysteries, he suddenly sensed that there was an inexplicable change in the empty space girl in front of him. With a thought, he opened his eyes and looked at the empty space girl. Space Maiden had already opened her eyes. She had even stretched herself out and was no longer sitting cross-legged like before. Her eyes flickered with all sorts of mysterious lights. There seemed to be boundless space-time flashing within them. Even her aura kept skyrocketing during this process. In the blink of an eye, it had surpassed what she originally possessed. She had just become a Khanate Grand Luo, which was equivalent to the 7th level of the Celestial Realm, reaching the 8th level of the Celestial Realm. From the looks of it, it was very obvious that the Space Maiden had obtained great benefits in the process of cultivating the cultivation method that Luo Fan had taught her. Her cultivation realm had finally broken through her original bottleneck, and she had obtained the great progress she had now. As her aura grew stronger, a faint smile gradually appeared on Space Maiden's face. This kind of smile did not have a trace of dust, it was extremely beautiful. Even Luo Fan had to admit that this kind of smile that came from the heart appeared on the face of the air hostess was a kind of almost perfect combination. It almost evolved the word beauty to the extreme. The joy and excitement in Space Maiden's heart was not as faint as it seemed on the surface. On the contrary, she was so overjoyed that she could not control herself. Among the many Khanate Grand Luo who were invited to explore the whirlpool of time, her cultivation realm was the lowest. She had just become a Khanate Grand Luo. Under such circumstances, she had to spend 100 times more effort than other Khanate Grand Luo cultivators to catch up to the others during the exploration process. In this way, it was imaginable how much pressure she had to endure and how much hope she had for her cultivation realm to break through. However, it was obvious that the improvement of her cultivation realm was not something that could be achieved just because she wanted to. Without a fortuitous encounter, no growth in knowledge, and no suitable method, she could only sigh at the unbreakable cultivation realm barrier no matter how much hope she had. In the past 100 years, the Space Maiden did not put much effort into improving her cultivation realm. In fact, all of her attention was placed on the cultivation method that Luo Fan had taught her. The reason why she circulated her cultivation method. It was only to maintain the balance in her body and to maintain the circulation of the cultivation method that Luo Fan had taught her. However, as the saying goes, a flower planted intentionally never blooms, while a willow planted unintentionally grows shade. With the help of the cultivation method, she changed her senses to the point that she could sense the power that was hidden within the source of her life. She suddenly felt the various flaws in her understanding of her own abilities in the past, and sensed the various mistakes she had made in her cultivation in the past. She could not help but start to make up for and modify these flaws and mistakes. Space Maiden cultivated the golden core path, but it was a path that was formed from her innate ability. The golden core path had gone through countless years of perfecting. There were even a few sages who had perfected it. Naturally, it was impossible for it to be incomplete. Therefore, the thing that restricted Space Maiden's cultivation realm, or rather, the bottleneck of Space Maiden, was the limitation of her knowledge of her own abilities. As such, in the past 100 years, Space Maiden had a new understanding of her own abilities. It was natural for her to make up for her flaws and correct her mistakes. She broke through the bottleneck that had shackled her for hundreds of millions of years. As a connate Grand Luo cultivator who had cultivated for billions of years, as long as she broke through the bottleneck, it was naturally extremely easy for her to improve her cultivation realm. That was why she had such a huge breakthrough. As the core of her comprehension over the past 100 years, she had an extremely deep understanding of the power that allowed her to possess that mysterious ability. Although she still could not compare to Luo Fan, she was already a few times stronger than she was 100 years ago. As her understanding of the power deepened, the ability that she displayed also greatly strengthened. At this moment, the world in Space Maiden's eyes was even flatter than it was 100 years ago. The superimposed space was now more distinct, and the time span that was displayed like a flat surface was several times longer than before. She could see through almost all the changes that had happened over millions of years. Of course, there was a limit to it. For an existence with an extremely high intrinsic quality like Luo Fan, Space Maiden's ability could not see through everything that was related to Luo Fan, including his past, present, and future. All she could see was a cloud of fog. She could not see through it at all. Space Maiden's aura permeated the area for a long time before she slowly retracted. "Thank you for your help, fellow Taoist. If it weren't for you, I'm afraid I wouldn't have been able to break through the bottleneck even after 1,000,000 years. Space Maiden bowed to Luo Fan. "It's just a matter of reciprocity. The fact that you were able to break through is due to your own good fortune. It has nothing to do with me." Luo Fan smiled. After hearing Luo Fan's words, the Space Maiden felt a little disappointed for some reason. However, she did not show it. She only faintly smiled and said, "I will remember your kindness in my heart." When she finished speaking, her expression returned to how it had been when Luo Fan first saw her. It was as if nothing had happened. What else could Luo Fan say to the Space Maiden like this? He could only smile and shake his head. The chaotic zones are the heart of the starfields of upheaval. To destroy the starfields of upheaval, we must first destroy this place. If you stay with me, we will be attacked by the starfields of upheaval. Why don't you leave the chaotic zones first? Space Maiden's expression didn't change much when she heard Luo Fan's words, but there was a slight tremor in her eyes. It was clear that she wasn't calm. However, as for how complicated the changes were, even she herself could not explain it clearly. After a moment of shock, she nodded. "If that's the case, I won't keep you any longer. I hope you will see me off." Luo Fan nodded. He raised his hand and gently waved it. Space Maiden's figure suddenly shook. She moved in a mysterious trajectory and instantly disappeared from the domain formed by the time force and the space force around him. Then, she continued to move outwards and disappeared from the chaotic zone. When she reappeared, she was outside the chaotic zones. In front of her was the chaotic zones where Luo Fan resided. Space Maiden floated in front of the chaotic zones. She sighed, and the light in her eyes flickered. She was no longer as calm as she had been before. As soon as she came to a stop, an incredible power gathered from all over the starfields of upheaval. It poured into the chaotic zones in front of her. Time and space within the starfields of upheaval began to change in a way that was 1,000 times faster than before. An indescribable pressure bore down on Space Maiden. Space Maiden felt as if she was bearing the weight of the entire universe. It was as if the universe itself was hostile to her. It wanted to erase her from the infinite space and time. It wanted her to cease to exist. It's that strong. Space Maiden realized what was happening. She couldn't help but be shocked. The air hostess had also found the core of the era projection before Luo Fan at the previous checkpoint, so it was natural. She had also personally destroyed the core of the era projection and personally endured the era projection's attacks and backlash. She knew how strong the era projection's attacks were. But at this moment, when he sensed the powerful might coming from all directions, he realized how insignificant the resistance he felt from the era projection was. Luo Fan had begun to destroy the chaotic zones, and the entire starfields of upheaval had begun to rebel. As for the Space Maiden, she was the one who felt the most powerful might. It was just the shockwaves of the era projection's power. The shockwaves alone were so strong, so unstoppable. It was easy to imagine how much power Luo Fan had to endure in the chaotic zones. With this thought in mind, the resentment in her heart that she did not know where it came from had completely disappeared as she continued to retreat. Instead, an inexplicable worry began to appear in her heart. Space Maiden could see the starfields of upheaval more clearly now that her abilities had improved. She quickly retreated. She didn't run into the chaotic zones, which were impossible to defend against. Instead, she easily bypassed the chaotic zones, and quickly retreated beyond the reach of the era projection's power. The moment the era projection appeared, the world that Empty Maiden saw crumbled with a loud bang, turning into countless fragments. Like a thick fog, they surged outwards continuously, directly devouring her, devouring everything within the range of her senses, causing her to fall into the thick fog. Within the thick fog a strange light shone. Not even the thickest fog could hide it. Space Maiden could see it clearly. It was clear. Within the light, a clear man floated calmly. His back was to her, and in front of him was the source of the thick fog. It was the core of the starfields of upheaval. It was Luo Fan. Space Maiden had seen the era projection, and it was clear that Luo Fan had destroyed the chaotic zones. He had destroyed the core of the starfields of upheaval. Space Maiden had felt as if, as soon as she left the chaotic zones, a powerful force had descended upon her and entered the chaotic zones. But in reality, time was relative inside the chaotic zones. No matter how much time passed in the chaotic zones, it was only a moment in the outside world. Therefore, in reality, from the time Luo Fan sent the Space Maiden out of the chaotic region until he began to destroy the entire chaotic region, several years had passed for him. In those years, he had broken through the barriers of the chaotic zones. He had found the key to the chaotic zones, which was the core of the starfields of upheaval. It was a cloud of smoke that looked extremely faint. If this smoke had appeared in the mortal world, it would have been as inconspicuous as the smoke of a kitchen chimney at dusk. But for it to appear in the chaotic zones, it was unimaginably mysterious. Just its appearance was enough to show how different it was from the rest of the starfields of upheaval. This smoke was the source of the entire starfields of upheaval. It was the source of the starfields of upheaval. The power of upheaval that affected the starfields of upheaval came from this smoke. Luo Fan was very interested in the mysteries of the smoke. It took him several years to understand it. He had a deeper understanding of the power of upheaval. He had a better understanding of the power he had acquired from Space Maiden. He had perfect control over the power that came from that power. Then, realizing that he could no longer learn anything useful from the smoke, Luo Fan did not hesitate to use the opposite power of the smoke. He shrouded the smoke and compressed it. He wanted to destroy the smoke and cut off the source of the upheaval. Then the smoke would spread and destroy the entire starfields of upheaval. At that moment, a boundless power that Space Maiden sensed descended out of nowhere, blasting into the chaotic region, wanting to completely erase all traces of Luo Fan's existence in the boundless spacetime. The result was obvious. The power of the poison was so strong that even Space Maiden couldn't withstand it. But for Luo Fan it was too diffuse. Luo Fan's mastery of power allowed him to easily withstand the effects of the poison. He didn't even sustain a single injury. Soon, the smoky core of the starfields of upheaval was gone. With the core gone, the starfields of upheaval had lost its most important link. His own power, was enough to cause the starfields of upheaval to collapse. When the air hostess saw him, the collapse was almost complete, and the chaotic zone had completely disappeared. To be continued.